Remarketing, but I always go back because they're home. They're like,
Chino eating food. You guys don't have to leave.
Yes, we are. No, really wasn't.
There was. Just figured it was going on.
What up, Jojo?
I'm good with that.
Yeah. July, how's that sound? Yeah, okay, August. We can make it worse.
We were talking about.
Whatever you want. Is you gonna do that for you?
Do you have the?
But I didn't get the set that.
Printed it off and then I left it.
I didn't know the criteria because I had to check.
Yeah, but the setbacks are regulated by the county. Or whoever. They're not.
It's in the backyard right behind the green.
how was the weather? Good?
Coming up.
Absolutely. You guys
Flying them out.
I'm used to being down there.
And it's actually, it was only about 70 degrees yesterday. Barely got cold.
I'm gonna have to clean up the
It's getting cold outside.
Yeah, I've got my extra layer for after the meeting. And I grew up in the mountains, so in the back of my car is the heavy jacket.
I really am.
Yeah, if you get Dodgers going.
No boots, because there was no snow forecast. So I figured I can get far enough to where I'd be below the snow line. But I,
I got to take my jacket off. It's like, okay, it might be all right.
Aaron, I have a question for you. So earlier in the meeting, when we were talking about changing the chamber announcing on the 11th, do you want me to email them and see if they can do it on the 28th? Are they not having it? Okay.
Well, and then there might be a second one if we still have the 11th meeting.
Okay, where they could
Come
do it
and
again.
do a second presentation, but see if they'll move it to the 28th. Otherwise,
As of right now, we don't have
may not
one.
even be
Okay.
opportunity. We don't know yet. We're waiting to see if the other item is going to go, but
Okay.
we may not have it.
Okay. All right. So I'll email both Kathy and Loretta.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I got the presentation on Zedra,
Thank you.
but I put the wrong number on it. Yeah, I've numbered mine 3. That's not the town. The title's right, just the numbers on it. I think it's put 3 instead of 4. But there's only 2 presentations in it.
Pinky, are we ready?
Yeah, I just texted Lon to see if he was coming, Councilmember Turner, see if he might be coming.
Is that a different version of one?
Yeah.
I didn't know there were 2 different people.
that's about a bean starter.
You know, Joel Baker? I think it kind of all started back with Joel Baker. He was vice mayor, and to this day, he still calls me, but it's not Pinky. Really loud and obnoxious.
Well, he's allowed to not to show it. Is he still with that?
Long drive back in the cold. Oh, Virginia? No.
It's not that long, really.
Lots of drama. He now lives on the East Coast with her kids. And he's over in Country West.
Are we waiting to hear back from Lonnie then?
Well, you can go ahead and say it.
You laughing at me?
With you. With you.
I wouldn't laugh.
We used to cut across on.
I was watching at the,
Why would you even watch it now?
I put my dad in
It's just frustrating.
organized.
Millions of dollars being spent for a
government, I'm loving the, I just like watching the roll call. It's kind of
Tom? You can make faces and we won't take it personally.
Yes. I'm not
Fire truck? It's only been 3 years, so. Sounds like you didn't have all the way to that. Good Lord.
But did you have propane? You should check your propane. So I said,
But the guaranteed maximum price even has a expiration date. I am probably not gonna get the whole.
You can just trot it around, you just really don't have time. I'll be done anyway.
Yeah, I've done that.
So I will kind of narrow it down to my own. So way too much back and forth trying to.
keeping her brow.
Director, I'm on the lynching for.
They won't see her. It's a hide over
I'm
here.
gonna say, Joanne, do you agree with that? Do you have anything to add? Anything to add?
Because I did give some time, I said, okay. This is taking.
Actually legally changed his name in the picture.
Thought it was at 6. You thought it was at 6. You wanna know if he should bring pizza and beer.
Yes.
I'm in. I'm gonna be here now.
They're checking my.
For refusing to take his hat off.
So I'll say yes on the pizza and beer, but not if it takes long.
So actually,
I think it was a pitch book. You wouldn't check it out.
I'm starting with the local lights.
I'll be here in 15, so I think we can get started.
What's that?
Right before I moved it.
From
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, folks, here we go. So we call this meeting to order at 5:09. Have a roll call, please.
Yes, you may. Councilmember Kelly is absent. Councilmember Turner is currently absent. Councilmember Perkins. Here. Councilmember Mendoza.
Here.
Councilmember Best.
Here.
Vice Mayor Miller.
Here.
And Mayor Croft is also absent.
Okay. Item number 2, presentation by Pat Walker with Pat Walker Consulting, discussion regarding impact fees. Is this you, Joe, or is it
Yes,
them?
it is.
Okay.
Vice Mayor Miller, thank you very much. I would like to introduce you to Pat Walker with Pat Walker Consulting. Pat has done work for the town of Chino Valley before. Is well known, Pat is, I can go on and on about her resume, what she's done. I'll let you do that, Pat. But, very respected in the state of Arizona and has always done really good work for the town of Chino Valley. So, we've asked her to do a presentation this evening to talk about impact fees and and then once she's done, we can open up to questions and have a discussion and see what you guys think. So with that, Pat, I'll turn it over to you.
It's my chair.
Okay.
I'm just kidding.
It's a recliner. Okay, as Joe said, Pat Walker with Pat Walker Consulting. I have been doing municipal finance, believe it or not, for over 40 years. I started working when I was 18 for a city in the Midwest and got my college degree and became a city accountant and then was hired by Chandler, Arizona back in '83. I was at Chandler for 23 years. I was a CFO. I retired from there and went with an international consulting firm for about 4 years, and I did consulting all across the country to municipalities, could be cities, towns, districts, fire districts, all kinds of things. Got tired of being on a plane and opened up my own business in 2012. And I'm here tonight with my partner, Kevin Burnett. He is with Wilden Financial Services, and Kevin and I, believe it or not, have been working together 17 years. We worked together when I was at Chandler, we worked together at Red Oak Consulting, and then he went over to Wilden Financial Services, and we have been doing impact fees and rate studies and all over Arizona for that many years. So a lot of experience there. I had a lot of experience with the impact fee law changes as well as with your town attorney. He's known, I don't know if you guys know that, but he is known as the legal guru in impact fees and the go-to person. Andrew and I work together in many, many cities and towns and just bounce things off of him when something comes up, and It always seems like something comes up, Andrew, I don't know why, but, it does, there's always a new avenue. But, we go back to 2010, when the 46305 was, born, and he was the one that was sitting at the table trying to make that the best statute he possibly could. He'll be the first to tell you it's not the best statute, and then he couldn't stop it, so he had to kind of negotiate the waters. But I was on a committee with him to put together what they call a model city ordinance, that when you adopt your fees, you adopt an ordinance, and it kind of describes it a little bit more detailed than the statute did, and that's what you're gonna see in my presentation too. I'm gonna talk a little bit about that. So we're gonna talk about water development impact fees, Arizona Revised Statute 946305. We're gonna talk about a little bit about ARS 951101, which is with water and sewer. You're not looking at that right now, but again, it's good to know the differences between the two, 46305 and 511, and then we'll talk about next steps and questions from there.
Just me? Look right on the top of you.
So what is a development impact fee? A development impact fee is a one-time charge. That's one thing that you gotta remember. When we say one time, that means it comes in the door one time when the building permit's pulled, and they pay it, and you can use it for capital. But it's not an ongoing that you can use for operation and maintenance and that sort of thing. It's to offset the cost of public service cost, or what you're gonna be referred to as necessary public improvements or services, to offset the cost of providing capital facilities for growth development. Through the ICMA, the International City Management Association, they spelled out a little bit more detail, and they say it's money's collected through a formally set schedule, a formula. It's levied against new development projects as a condition against permit approval, support infrastructure. And one thing you're gonna hear throughout this presentation is proportionate share. The statute's very big on that, saying that they should not have to pay more than their fair share of the cost of development. So that's why you look at residential, single family, you look at commercial, you look at what costs are truly associated with new development and what is considered existing development, because you can't put that on the backs through impact fees. You'll probably hear different titles depending on where you go and what they call them. It could be called an investment fee, a system development charge. I know back in the day in Chandler, we only had water and sewer. In fact, we were one of the first cities to do all the other impact fees, police and fire and parks and all that. We only had water and sewer system, but they were the same as impact fees, capacity fees, or something that you have is called a buy-in fee. It's the same thing. It's like a methodology, but what you do is you have a buy-in to the existing capacity of your system, so those people coming in are paying for the capacity that they're using up, so you have money for the future for expansion. So what can you fund with development impact fees? Excess capacity of existing facilities. You can recoup the money for that, because you may have to expand it because they are coming in and using it up, and you have to expand 3 years in advance. They prepare their share of the system too. You build all the infrastructure, you put everything in, they need to pay their fair share of it. Can you do improvements required to service existing development efficiencies? No. One of the things the law makes clear is that you can't improve services with it. You can, if your services are gonna go down every time you add a new person, then you can keep it at the same level. But if you think you're gonna get impact fees to improve services, that's where they draw the line. They say, no, you gotta define what your existing service level is today, and we don't mind paying impact fees to maintain that, but we're not gonna maintain the efficiency that you had through growth fees. Maintenance and repairs, we said no, and then improvements required to service new development, yes. So, and then you look at your growth-related projects under capital improvement plan. We'll be talking about an infrastructure improvement plan. How much are you gonna cash fund? How much are you gonna do debt? You can put in debt service payments for growth-related project and impact fees. In impact fees, there's different methodologies, and this is where you get where a consultant comes in, even by the law, it has to be done by a professional outside person. It can't be done in-house. It has to be done outside. And no, we didn't write that in the statute. I don't think you did either. That was done by the development committee.
It actually started as engineers only, and it got changed back to qualified professionals, what do we call them?
Yeah.
Because we knew that planning and development firms did it too, as well as engineering firms. But the infrastructure part of it was gonna be done by engineers, but the finance part of it was not, because we don't let engineers do things with numbers.
Engineering, so.
It'll cost
I got that on tape.
The cost will be completely wrong if we do it that way.
I got that on tape.
So there's different methodologies you can use, and it depends on your community. No two communities are alike. So in other words, if you've got a lot of capacity that you've got, and you need people to buy into it, you do the buy-in methodology, and that's what you do here for your water and sewer capacity. Or it could be in facilities or other infrastructure, parks, whatever. Incrementals, where it's forward-looking, it looks at future facilities that add capacity for new development. When you're looking towards the incremental, it can also be called plan-based, it's talk about the future, and really it's better if you've got master plans, like transportation plan, a park plan, those kind of things, anything. If you don't have that, at least you have something in your CIP, that you have at least an engineering firm's cost estimates. It's just something you can't just throw out there anymore. The reason the law changed, and you're gonna hear this theme throughout, is because somebody did something, probably pushed it out a little bit too far. So people were throwing cost in, wish list in, maybe. I'm not saying, that everybody would think so, but all it takes is one poster child to get a law change. And somebody probably was just throwing in projects and not really having good documentation and where they came from and no plans with it, so that's probably why the law changed. On the hybrid, it can be both. You might have existing capacity and you might have some new things that you wanna add. If you do that, you should imagine your fee's gonna be higher, cause you're recouping what you have here today and you have what you wanna plan for the future. So depending on what methodology, where you're at in your community on growth, what you have available is gonna determine the methodology. And that's where you have your consultants come in, talk to staff, and really, okay, where are you guys at? What do you have today? What are you gonna plan for the future, and what type of methodology? Sometimes we do all three. We calculate all three just to say what makes the most sense, for your community. So some of the key methodology considerations is there's no single right answer to which method should be used. The law doesn't dictate what methodology you should use. The law dictates all the publication requirements, what kind of improvements can be, the necessary public improvements, and all that, but there's not on the methodology. And there's pros and cons to each method, and it can be calculated different ways, and it depends if you're gonna have fee areas or not. Sometimes cities, and we really, there's a lot of them that do it, not a lot of them, but there's some bigger cities that do it, where they have service areas. In other words, this is where the fee is for this part of the city in the transportation plan. This is what it is in this part of the city. But most places, kind of rest back on, it's one transportation system. At the end of the day, everybody uses the main arterial roads to get everywhere, and so and Kevin's gonna be getting into that. It's a very complex calculation on how you do it, but it's something that's defensible. And that's one thing that we, as consultants, have to do. We have to be able to defend it. If it goes to court and get challenged by the Home Builders Association, Valley Partnership, we've gotta make sure we can defend it in any methodology. One of the things that we're gonna be asking about, do you have any current outstanding development impact fee related debt? Have you sold anything that you're paying for, a growth related project that we've included in impact fees? We're gonna look at any existing diff fund balances. That's easy for you guys because you have none. So you don't collect any impact fees and you've spent, it looks like, all your money pretty much. We'll look at the allowable growth related capital needs. We'll be looking to staff to tell us this is growth related and how much percentage of that is growth related. And they'll probably be looking at engineers to help determine what that is. But we have to know that because you don't want to put non-growth related projects against an impact. And then the ability to gather data required for IEP study. We'll need to have population, commercial projections. What's your 10-year forecast? You're looking at a 10-year plan for non-utility development impact fees and 15-year horizon if you were doing water and sewer. And they must be built in the next 10 years. That was new in the law that put a time limit on it, that if you're gonna put it in your plan, you need to build it the next 10 years. However, as we've learned through the years, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Andrew, but that could be a hard one to press, if pressed on, right? What do you think?
One of the things that we learned when we were trying to fight the statute is that if you leave things vague enough in the statute, you can go back and redefine them for yourself later on in your ordinance. This was one of the areas that we think we won, because the refunds of the fees that you haven't yet built can only be requested by the owner of the property at the time. So it's not something the developer can do and come back and en masse, but that only lasted for a while, because I've recently heard the discussion of a class action that one developer who still had fees yet to pay would bring a class action and bring everybody else in. So,
Just when you think.
little victories turn into, I guess not.
Can I ask a quick question on that?
Sure.
Would stormwater be considered utility or
Yes.
non-utility?
We would
They
call
even
it.
have, they mentioned stormwater project.
But stormwater is a utility, but it's not in the 15-year category, just water and sewer.
Okay,
It's in the 10 years.
that answers it.
It's
Thank
a
you.
utility.
And some must with development impact fees, they must demonstrate demand, benefit, and proportionality. Demand what you need to build in order to maintain existing service levels for new development. So that's why you have to prove what the existing service levels are, because that's what the requirement is of the statute. The benefit, how and when will the development community benefit from the development fees they're paying, and the proportionality, residential versus commercial paying their fair share. So water and sewer, we're not gonna spend a lot of time on this. This is another statute, it's 9/5/1101. And they're saying, well, you can do a water and sewer development impact fee under 46305, or you can do one under a capacity fee under 9/5/1101. Well, what's the difference? Well, mainly the main difference, I guess, is that the 46305 is just within the boundaries. If you got serving customers within the boundaries of the city or town, it's 46305. 511 is you serve both citizens inside and outside the corporate boundaries of your city or town. The other thing about it is that for the plus side for a city or town, and it was really adopted after 463, not the remake of 46305, but the original statute of 46305. This was adopted afterwards. So there was a need for a development community that wanted to be able to have a faster way of getting water and sewer capacity, because they can't build if there's not something there, you know. So this is all under the water and sewer rates and water and sewer buy-in or capacity fees, and this statute covers that about the requirements, the notice of intent, written report, 60-day notice. And I saw on your website you've done all that. I saw that you did an in-house, that you included all the things with the cash projections and everything that you're required according to statute. And it looks like you're good to go on your capacity fees, your buy-in fees. So again, this statute was a major policy change regarding funding, financing, and infrastructure, and as Andrew has said in many presentations, it was a virtual rewrite of the development fee statute. They might as well just throw the thing out, but it was cut and paste from a lot of different places. I think Texas and
4 states.
4 states. So it was very convoluted when they brought it together. To get it to be understandable has been quite the challenge, because you have all these 4 states bringing things together on it. It provided new timelines for adoption, and then cities are impacted differently.
I didn't have time to stop.
A study takes about 12 to 15 months to complete, and that's if everything goes well. And the reason I say well is it depends on how many stakeholder meetings you want to have, how much reach out you want to do. And on top of that, if you want to have special council meetings to approve things, there's these time limits. Once the clock starts ticking, you're on a faster track. But there's some places where you can stop and go along the way, and that can be what happens. It can take 12 to 18 months to complete. We don't really like to take longer if we can help it, because guess what? Your numbers get old and you have to refresh them then, especially when you look at the cash fund balances and audits and all that stuff. So the longer you wait, then you go, oh, wait a minute, now we gotta go back and update all the financial information, and it gets kind of crazy. So we try to stay along if we can along the path, but it all depends on, you know, how much outreach you want to do. You got to forecast growth-related revenues to offset costs of the new infrastructure and facilities, and you have to show it by service unit and service area requirements. If you're going to have service areas, you don't have to have a service area if you can prove it's one system type thing, as I mentioned before, but you already have to be able to show the impact to that particular service area and why you're charging a different fee than to another area of the city. So what's not allowed down the statutes? Well, the old city halls and general government facilities, you can't build those anymore by impact fees. There was a grandfathering thing. If you already had debt, you could grandfather in debt service, but you're not in that position. You used to have general government impact fees, but a long time ago, but you haven't applied them since the statute came out. As I mentioned before, you can't do administrative operating maintenance costs. You're limited on projects, and I'll get into more detail on that for police, fire, parks, and library. You can't do the increased level of service, and then parks over 30 acres that do not show a direct benefit to new development impact fees can't be used for that. So if you're over 30 acres, so most cities and towns that we've worked with stay under the 30 acres. In fact, I don't know of anybody that's gone over 30, do you?
Well, yes.
Okay,
Gilbert went over 30.
okay. And were they challenged?
No, because it was
They did the direct benefit?
it was direct benefit, and they were using old fees.
Oh, okay. So one of the things that are requirements in the statute is you have to prepare what they call an infrastructure improvement plan. And it can be the same as your CIP, but it requires certain information in it that may be more than your CIP. You have to disclose the existing infrastructure, the available capacity and cost. You don't normally see that in a CIP unless you go into a lot of detail. You have to identify public service areas for necessary public improvements. We mentioned if you go service areas. The infrastructure improvement plan and the fee study has to be interrelated because you've got to be able to show the cost of this capital for growth-related projects is tied to the fee. So that's why that they're tied together, even though they're adopted separately at a different time, and there's steps along the way that you adopt, you know, your land use assumptions, your infrastructure improvement plan, and then your fees at the very end. Except that I don't know of a case where we haven't been along the way. When you're adopting your land use assumption, your IIP, everybody goes, well, what's the fee gonna be? Well, so we calculate it, but that doesn't mean that's the final fee. That just means that's what it is at the time you adopt your IIP and your LPA. And as I mentioned, they must be justified in the IIP. It should be updated at least every 5 years. There should be a public hearing for land use, qualified professional, that's the other thing, licensed in Arizona, is what it says. And must define completion dates of projects. And as I mentioned before, 15 years for water and sewer, 10 years for all other categories. IIP land use assumptions is not can or might, it says shall be adopted or updated before fee adoption, so you do have to adopt them first. The land use assumptions must conform to general plan. That's one of the things we're gonna be asking, or does this conform to your general plan? Your plan updated and does it conform to it? Overall, in general, because general plan is just what it is. It's general about where population and commercial is gonna go in the future in your general plan. It identifies projects and service areas, and then projects and services for new development. Land use assumptions, this is the city's growth projections for the next 10 years, and it does say 10 years. Residential, multifamily, industrial, commercial, those are the categories we would be asking for. What are the projections for the future? Sometimes you can get that from the county, or there's some economic development places that have this, or, you know, and again, some cities or towns don't have this, or MAG, but down in the valley, Maricopa, but what do you guys have up here for, does economic transportation estimates and stuff? Yeah, we've got a couple, like, Simpo has some things, Maggie's gotten some data from different organizations on growth, but.
Okay.
Yeah,
So sometimes we have to reach out and try to find what makes the most sense if you don't have them, or what projections are, you know, do you agree with this? I mean, we have to work with staff extensively to come up with these figures. These aren't something that we can tell you what it needs to be. We can look at trends from the past. We can see what building permits are gonna be for the future, land uses that are in the general plan, and help along that way, but it's gonna have to come from the
Yeah.
staff.
Can I ask a quick question about
Sure.
that? When we were doing transportation planning with Simpo, there was a term they used, conforming and non-conforming growth, or something like that. Have you? They were only allowed, ADOT was only, or I think it was ADOT was only allowed, they were only allowed to use basically the census data, but some of the other communities also plugged in like known approved developments that had gone in too, but, so they put that in appendix, I think, but they weren't allowed to use that in their base calculations for some federal reason, I think, but we could use any of that sort of information for growth. It doesn't necessarily have to be classified as anything.
I haven't seen it classified in any of our studies,
Okay.
so I think that we.
Yeah, I think that may have been tied to some of the federal highway stuff or
And the
something.
funds that support those projects probably, requirement maybe,
So yeah, I think they were locked into census projections, basically.
yeah.
Well, the reality is though, you use your general plan as the basis for it. But then you go back to the general plan categories and you take what kind of activity you've had in those various categories over a period of time, look at your census data and see what reasonably makes sense, because that's the area you're gonna get challenged on, is that the developers will not agree with your growth projections. Because if you have too high of a growth projection, then you're going to extrapolate infrastructure that may be more than what's gonna be necessary during that 10 to 15 year period, so it's really the root of all of it, and if you are off by a bit, you can send your numbers really high pretty quickly.
Okay.
So one of the things in the statute too is that they require that there be an advisory committee or a biennial audit, and I'll talk about the makeup of that. What we always have been recommending, and I've seen in most places, a combination, they might have an ad hoc advisory committee, or just strictly do a biennial audit. And what that is that it
if you go with the advisory committee, it advises on land use plans, IIP and development fee report. They have to monitor the implementation of the IIP. It has to be made up of 6 members, 5 members for quorum, 3 from building, real estate development, and 1 in home building, and municipal officials and employees cannot be members, if you go the advisory committee route. On a biennial audit, this is in addition to an annual report that's required. You're required by every September to post an annual report of how much it can be unaudited, it doesn't have to be audited, it says that in the statute, but it's the revenues and expenditures, what you spent your money on, what you brought in, and that sort of thing. But in addition to that, this would be like after 2 years, you have to do a biennial audit with an outside firm that doesn't do the development fee. So like if we were to do the development fee study, we couldn't come in and do the biennial audit because we can't audit ourselves. So every 2 years, somebody has to come in and do an audit. And in the audit, it's gotta be conducted by qualified professionals. That doesn't mean a CPA firm. They've already ruled it doesn't have to be a CPA firm. A lot of other firms come in and do it as an audit. I mean, you know, there's other firms that do development impact fees, and so they may do an audit on another city or town.
Yeah, Carter Froelich did one for crying out loud.
It's what?
Carter Froelich did one for crying out loud.
Oh, I know. I wouldn't refer to that. I will. The reviews, the collection and expense of HPs of each project is in the review, level of service in each service area, land assumptions, and then public hearing within 60 days of release of the audit. And so that's why we see a lot of people that just go with the audit. It's still oversight of what you've done, and if you haven't done the right thing, it's gonna come out in the audit. But on the other hand, there's a lot of steps, as you can see, associated with that advisory committee. And so a lot of times somebody that doesn't have the formal action, they might have an ad hoc, a biennial, but mainly I've seen the biennial audit. So, most places. Prior development fees. This is what I understood you had: police, roads, streets, library, parks and recreation. This was the fee schedule that you had before, and the fees that you had. As you can see, they were pretty low for what I would say I've seen in most cities and towns.
Yeah, but that was a while ago. Even a while ago, that was low.
Yeah.
No. Everybody complained.
Well, of course, anything. So the statute now defines necessary public service, means facilities are now available to collect impact fees, have a life expectancy of over 3 or more years, and are owned and operated by or on behalf of a municipality. So in the instance of 946305 for fire and police facilities, fire and police facilities do not include a facility or portion of facility that is used to replace services that were once provided elsewhere in that municipality. Vehicles and equipment used to provide administrative services, helicopters, so you know somebody claimed a helicopter somewhere.
They claimed that Mesa had it in their study, but they didn't.
They didn't.
No. And then Scottsdale was talking about a helicopter, and so they made sure to put it in there, so
And
Scottsdale.
airplanes too.
Mojave
sure what
County's
they-
got an airplane.
Mojave County has an airplane, that's probably where
That's
it came
right.
from.
And, or a facility that's used for training firefighters or officers from more than one station or substation.
Gripstick,
What?
Gripstick,
Groups?
Glendale Regional Public Safety Training Facility. I can pretty much tell you every piece of that statute.
As I'm telling you, somebody was a poster. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Hypothetically, if we were to be building a new police station, we would be able to allocate impact fees towards that, paying off the debt that the loan we would hypothetically take out if the council should choose to go that route.
We'd have to prove that if there's a portion of it, we have to have a formula to show that this is how we got to this portion is growth related. Are you gonna be financing it or just paying, okay, so we can put
Hypothetically
towards the
speaking.
debt service.
Well, and importantly too, one of the things that you'd have to spend a lot of time calculating is the deficiency, because you have a very robust
Deficient.
public record about how deficient your current resources are. So your level of service might be, here is where you wanna be to serve everyone, and you might be here for current residents. That delta has to be paid for out of non-development fee money. So in the repayment portion, you wouldn't be able to repay all of the debt service you took on.
And that's the hardest part for people to understand is that delta on the existing level to the increased level of service and proving where that point is and what methodology you use to prove that point. And that can vary too, depending on what you use.
And there's a portion of the statute that says you're not allowed to increase your level of service beyond what you serve your existing residents. And the Home Builders Association, Central Arizona and Southern, both of them, have taken the position that means you can never increase your level of service. Those of us who were there at the beginning dispute that heavily because it would mean that in high growth communities, you're at, Buckeye's at the service level that it was when it was 15,000 people instead of 83,000 people. That doesn't make any sense. That you won't have development fees paid for it is what the statute really says. And so that calculation of how are we going to pay for our existing residents is a very important thing. And the cities who have gotten in trouble have been the ones that haven't shown where that money's coming from. So if you had existing real debt and you were paying debt service regardless of whether you had development fees, and then you took a portion of that and used development fees to pay it, that would be okay, as long as the calculation appeared fair. Hypothetically.
And there has been challenges to that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're defending a lawsuit from Marana right now on the allocation of new growth and non-growth, or in existing growth, for a wastewater treatment plant that they had to acquire from the county.
Oh, that's the fun one we,
Yeah.
Marana versus Pima County?
Yeah, so that excellent lawsuit, they gave us all kinds of other things too, but, yeah.
Where it talks about how A is a factor instead of specific.
Yeah, that particular allocation is continuing on, and they're still fighting about the allocation of growth and new growth for wastewater treatment, which is the core development requirement. It's interesting.
And I mentioned earlier that in 2010, I sat on the committee with Andrew on creating the model city ordinance, and the reason that it was created was to try to bring clarification to the Bray statute. And so you're gonna see this has a lot more information in it, but the thought was that with the guys that were sitting at the table with the Home Builders Association knew what they were talking about and some of the discussion, and we kind of put it into the model city ordinance, basically to try to clarify it, but.
That's a nice way to say that we planted Easter eggs in a statute that we exploited with the model ordinance.
He said it, not me.
But
okay?
it really was for that purpose, that legislative discretion was absolute prior to the statute. And the statute took away all discretion, was trying to put things into boxes where if I have a development here, the only things you can build are the things that are right next door to me and benefit. And you just can't do that with infrastructure. It has to be more globally approached because your dollars aren't going to pay for something by themselves. They need other people's dollars with them. And so the legislative discretion you all have as a council still exists. And the statute tried to take away the ability for you to decide what's best for your community. And so in those areas where we could reassert legislative discretion, we did. And to some extent it matters, and to some extent it's just more functional. But this model ordinance was blessed by the Home Builders Association that brought the statute in the first place. So we vetted it with them and up front. So
But don't they deny that they were 100% agreement now?
I have to remind them all the time. And I go and pull the emails out of them. Yes, you said here you agree to this thing. But it really highlights the problem of trying to address an issue at the statewide level that isn't unified statewide. That development is different in every single community in the state. Everybody has a different thing that is their focus. And you can't treat a Buckeye with an incorporated area bigger than Phoenix that has massive infrastructure that they're building with a Fountain Hills that is at its maximum extent and is never going to grow any bigger than it currently is. Those two are just not the same, but the statute doesn't treat them the same. So we try to infuse a little bit more of the local control back in the ordinance.
So that's why it's important, the model city ordinance. That's one of the things as consultant check is let's read the model city ordinance, because some people took a little bit of creativity with it along the way and added things or deleted things. So when we go in, we say we want to see your model city ordinance that adopted the fees, because that's part of the guide too. It's not just a statute, it's what you've adopted in there too. But in this case, you guys don't have the fees in place right now, so you'll be creating this as you go through this process if you decide to go that route. On fire protection, again, we talked about fire and police before, but again, they broke it out a little bit more to include a little bit more information. But it sticks more to the statute than the police one. I think we had a little bit more meat in the police one than we did the fire. And with that, I'll turn it over to my partner, Kevin Burnett. He's gonna tell you a little bit about himself and the Wilden Financial Services itself. Like I said, I work exclusively with impact fees with Wilden Financial Services, because he's been in Arizona for a long time, even though he lives in Denver, he should have a second home.
I should have a second home.
Because he's here all the time, but I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, so as Pat alluded to earlier, we've been working together since 2003, I think. I think he said. I've been doing this kind of work since April of 2001, so coming up on 19 years of doing this. So Pat was one of my first clients that I worked with, and we've been working together while she was at Chandler, and then since she left Chandler, ever since. Wilden Financial Services, we're headquartered in California, in Temecula, so I'm kind of responsible for the Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado type area. Most of my work is here in Arizona, hence why Pat thinks I should have a second home here. Doing water and sewer rate studies, the impact fees, both the utility side and the non-utility side. Pat talked about the biennial audits a little bit. I've done quite a few of those across the state, for the clients that I didn't do the impact fees themselves for, because as Pat mentioned, it would be inappropriate for me to audit myself in my own work. I'd probably give myself a glowing recommendation and say everything was perfect with it, so that's not allowed. But so Pat and I work together most often. We've got about a dozen or so people in the Wilden Financial Services group that we pull on as needed, but Pat and I are primarily the go-to people on the work that we're doing. And given that we've been working together so long and know each other so well, she gave me the two hardest fees to talk to you all about here, so I want to thank her for that. So the road and street fees, the reason that this one is the most difficult is just the calculation that is done on road and streets is different from any other fee area that we work on. The police and fire that Pat touched base on, they're fairly similar in how they're calculated, but streets are an animal unto themselves. So you had the way the ordinance was written, which I just clicked off of, it was basically your collector streets, your arterial streets. So if you go into a subdivision, you're not doing impact fees for the individual streets within a subdivision. It's more the arterial, the big main throughway type streets, includes traffic signals and that kind of thing. The model city ordinance, as was the case with police and fire, embellishes a little bit. So they've got some other things in there, the bridges, culverts, storm drains, etc., that they're including within impact fees for roads and streets.
One thing that was new here that surprised me was they added collector streets in this order from the prior statute, which would expand them a
Right.
little bit, which surprised me.
Well, I think what the developers found is that there's a constant tug of war between builders and developers. The developers want to have as many things in development fees as humanly possible because it offsets the cost to them to build a big subdivision. The builders want as few things in the development fees as possible because they want to have the lowest fees as they can so that they can be as competitive as possible with the home. And the two are absolutely at opposite ends of the spectrum until you go to the legislature, and you'd think they were on the same side. And I quizzed the developer about that. I said, we're the ones fighting for your benefit. Why is that? And he said, well, those are our customers. And so it came pretty clear that the two different interests were in this statute of what they were trying to gain from the benefit of the statute. And ironically, I asked that same developer, well, what happens if we take away development fees? And he says, well, I'll build it all and put it in the price of my land. So, I mean, it was maddening, but that's where we are. This is one of the things that collector streets started to become part of regional infrastructure, because if you got, in the valley, you've got big section line roads. The half-mile streets are almost as busy as the section line roads are. So that's why collector streets ended up in there from the home builder perspective.
So there's really no difference between arterials and collectors now, because
not for development fee purposes.
Okay, because we call our roads arterials, but the feds might call them collectors and that sort of thing, so.
No, it's what you designate as a collector arterial. And really, it's what carries the main bulk of the traffic.
Okay.
You know, it's not the neighborhood inside the subdivisions. How do people get to and from?
Yeah, I always define it as it gets you from neighborhood to neighborhood.
So Chino.
Yep. Arterial.
All right, so if we get into an example of how streets or transportation is calculated, what we're trying to I'm not gonna get too deep into this.
Please.
We're trying to figure out in all cases, what's the impact or what's the capacity that's being used up by the new development. That's what we're trying to figure out with our impact fees. So in the case of transportation, we're starting with the number of vehicle trip ends. So how many trips are generated by a particular development? So if you build a single-family home, how many trips are generated from that single-family home? And then there's a trip adjustment factor that we take into account.
That's total trip, not trip end.
So the trip adjustment factor is in recognition of the fact that if you leave your house to run to the store and come back to your house, that's 2 trips generated from your house, one leaving and one coming back. But really, it's only one round trip. So we have to make an adjustment for that. The length of the trip, and this is gonna vary by community. The example that Andrew had, the trip length in Buckeye is gonna be vastly different than what your trip length is in Fountain Hills. So the demand that's placed on the system and the need of the system itself and the overall capacity is gonna be very different depending upon the size of the community. So if we multiply those first 3 pieces together, that tells us how many vehicle miles are traveled from a particular development. If we take the vehicle miles traveled and multiply that by the unit cost, that gets us our fee per development unit. So then just a quick example here. So if we assume a single family home generates 9.57 vehicle trip ends, we're adjusting it by 50% to recognize the fact that they're round trips. That gives us an adjusted vehicle trip end of 4.79. We're going to assume the average trip length is 3.9 miles. So in this case, our single family home generates 18.71 vehicle miles. If we take it to the next step and say that our calculated cost is $300.02 per vehicle mile traveled, the impact fee or development impact fee for that single family home would be $5,614.
And that's just for the road.
Yep, and that's just for the road.
Would that, the trip length, would that stop at your town limits? You wouldn't, like, if, you're not talking like an origin destination, are you?
It would be within your town boundaries.
Yeah, like if they're going to Prescott or Prescott
Right,
Valley,
we're not
you
paying-
just,
we're not paying for the roads in between.
No.
Yeah, yeah.
And this calculation can even go another step. That if you go to the store on your way home from your drive to and from work, there's even a factor for calculating in how you reduce it again
Right.
to account for now you're combining trips.
Right. So your primary destination versus secondary destinations.
This is why this one's maddening.
This one is really hard, so that's why you wanna have a transportation plan if you can, because this information comes from that, or the ITE manual that you have. That information comes from that,
Supposed to
census
be.
data and things, we can gather it all, but it's nice to have a transportation plan that you can hang your hat on. We'd like to see that, if not, you can use other things, but.
So the next one is parks and recreation. So while the street one is technically more difficult to calculate, the parks and recreation fees, at least in my opinion, is philosophically more difficult to try and weed out. Because a lot of the times the park and recreation fee, the level of service that we're trying to achieve is X number of park acres per 1,000 residents or something like that. So that calculation itself is relatively straightforward compared to streets. But with park and recreation, you get into the fact, well, if we have a soccer field, are we allowed to build a baseball field? Is that an equivalent level of service, or are they just 2 completely different things and you can't equate one with the other? And getting into some of those more philosophical discussions. So you've got the ordinance up there. We talked a little bit about the 30 acres, under 30 acres versus over 30 acres. Some of the other things that, as Pat said, somebody did something bad or pushed the envelope. So you see what's excluded there: bandstands, bathhouses, boathouses,
I don't know who did back.
I don't
greenhouse.
know.
Riparian areas is Gilbert, wetlands is Gilbert.
Tempe Town Lake.
Equestrian facilities is Queen
I
Creek.
think Buckeye was the lake, wasn't
Buckeye was the lake.
Yeah.
Pat and I worked on one that wanted to do golf courses prior to this new statute coming into
Is that
effect.
Scottsdale?
And that made us squeamish back then.
Yeah.
I don't know, frankly, who came up with the distinction between the no to aquatic centers but the yes to pools, but
That's his next thing.
No, the equestrian facilities?
no equestrian facilities, and which is part of the whole local control issue. Equestrian facilities are the heart of Queen Creek. That community is a horse community. They have easements in between their subdivisions for horses. And so to tell that town council, you're not allowed to do that as a necessary public service, just really didn't seem right, but there it is. Complete ban. Thankfully, they had some outstanding debt already. So.
Wetlands.
So then there's the model city ordinance, which again puts a little bit of different flavor on what the statute said.
Could you do mules or they still look good?
Yeah.
Once you start to get cute, and that's when you get back in front of the legislature and things get ugly.
Too clever for your own good.
So, and they, as we were talking about, they do make a distinction between the swimming pool and the aquatic center. So if you have a local swimming pool, that's something that's allowed. If you get into the aquatic center and it's an Olympic type facility with Olympic sized swimming pool and all the different level of springboards and high boards and bleachers and everything else, then
Or even the splash pad.
splash pad, yeah.
What this turned into is that the schools would do the splash pad kind of water play set, and the cities would do the swimming pool next door to it, and they put them together in a joint facility. It's just odd. That seems to be okay with the development. Not sure why.
So then there's the definition of the direct benefit. So that goes back to the case if you're building a park that's over 30 acres, you have to be able to prove that there's a direct benefit associated with that size of facility or size of park.
Did Gilbert use a survey or something, or how did they prove the direct benefit over 30 acres? Oh.
I think we're not gonna put that on a public record.
Okay.
Yeah.
Our swimming pool is constantly full during the summer, but we're always running. And then would we be able to use these fees to hypothetically expand or hypothetically cover the swimming pool?
Expand the swimming pool, it depends on whether or not it
The
was rebuilt
facility.
or not. And if it was just because you just wanted to expand it to increase the level of service, we couldn't do that. But we could, if you were going to expand it because it was gonna be bigger to be able to accommodate more populations coming in. Those are the things we would look at.
Or stay open longer?
Well, that gets into operations.
And maintenance,
It
yeah.
does. And impact fees, yeah. That's maintenance.
I'm
costs.
asking a lot of hypothetical questions.
No, that's good.
They're good.
They're good. That's what you have to do through this whole process, is to ask some kind of questions.
And I can't blame that on the statute at all, because we made that definition up to try and define direct benefit.
Thanks,
It's-
Andrew.
It's in the statute, so we had to figure out something. So we figured out what we could live with that wouldn't be offensive. That was the best we could.
A lot of words.
It is a lot of words, but we had a lot of interest in what people wanted in that direct benefit.
I'm gonna go back here. So I'll put in, what's with the community centers greater than 3,000 square feet? Is there any?
I don't remember if it
That
was.
was a weird amount.
Because people were building great big community centers.
Yeah, Chandler had one under construction at the time that might have been the impetus for it. But the complaint there, and the home builders in Goldwater actually sued over it, was that they were competing with private entities. That if they were building them too big, then someone like LA Fitness or any of those folks, you were competing with them with private, public dollars, so.
That one just always jumps out at me. If some of you were here earlier, Pat outed me for being Canadian. And all of our municipalities have to have a hockey arena in it, and you can't build a hockey arena that's under 3,000 square feet by Canada law. It's just not allowed, so.
Yeah. You'd have to give that over to the curling people.
Which could happen.
Well, where is that in Chino Valley?
It's right as you're coming into town at 2 o'clock, right before the first roundabout, off to the right, it's
Yeah.
right there.
There's usually a boat out in the middle.
Yeah, yeah.
I saw that too,
Yeah, I found it too. So with that background on the different fees and everything there, we'll do a pretty quick run through of what the capital financial planning process is. So a lot of this is stuff that we've touched on before. So step one is trying to figure out what information's available to us, and what can we get our arms around so that we know how to develop the fee. So whether it's customer demand, economic development, what your master plans are, what your philosophies are in terms of growth. So once we have a handle on that, if there's a facility master plan, a streets master plan, a parks master plan, that's ideal for us. Not every community that we work with has the master plan, so we work with what we've got.
What if you have no master plan?
In those cases, we will work with what we've got. It's certainly a little bit more difficult for us, but it's something that we've worked with enough communities that don't have the master plans that we kind of know what questions to ask. We can't give you the answers, but we can point you in the right direction of this is what we've done elsewhere, or this is how we've done things in the past, and we've used this information. Again, as Pat alluded to earlier, we aren't going to be able to answer those questions for you in terms of what's your development going to be, what are your roadway needs going to be. We can ask questions about it and help guide you, but ultimately it's the town that's going to have to provide us with those answers. And even if you do provide us answers, we're not just going to accept them as gospel, so don't be offended if that's the case. Part of our job is to challenge and make sure that it's been flushed out and looked at every way possible, so that when we get to the end, we don't have any issues that the development community comes back and says, well, you can't do that, or you shouldn't have done that, or whatever the case is.
Yeah, it's not that you can't do projects, it's just how you're gonna pay for them, that's all. And that's why you gotta really look at what resources do you have available to pay the non-growth side. And as Andrew was alluding to earlier, you have to disclose that. How are you gonna pay for this on that other side? Because a lot of people think, oh, well, I'm gonna do all this with impact fees, but if only 20% is growth related and 80% is non-growth, they're gonna go, well, then how are you gonna do the other 80%, especially within 10 years? So it's really an important factor when you look at it. You can do whatever projects you want, it's just what you can pay for out of it.
Yeah, and I will say, we do have some studies, like we've got a transportation study, but it's 13 years old. You can look at, you can look at maybe some planning dollars from ADOT might be available for stuff like that, or we've got an outdated sewer study as well, but, so you're not, technically, you can use those and maybe save $1 to update them.
Right, but they're pretty old, most of them.
Yeah, when you get 10, 15 years old, there's not much
And
data.
sometimes say, we wanna hold off, we wanna get this study done first, and then, head into the development. And you can do other fee areas, you don't have to do them all at once.
Right.
So you can start on another area then, depending on what you wanna do.
So we'll take what information we have from the master plan or whatever available data you have, and that'll get turned into a capital, probably your CIP, your capital improvement plan, which will then get translated into your IIP. So that'll say, this is what our current infrastructure is, this is what our current level of services is, this is what we want to build going forward, and this is what the level of service is going to be going forward. Once we have that, we can move into step 5 and calculate the fees. In the hypothetical example of the new police station, it might be that it's 25% growth and 75% non-growth, so we'll need to make sure we identify what other revenue sources are available to fund that project. We can't just throw a project in there that's not 100% growth and not come up with some way of paying for it. The development community will take a pretty hard look at that and say, you haven't identified how you're paying for the rest of this, so prove to us that it's not all coming out of development fees.
So when it comes to the roads and streets, we last year had gone out for a potential property tax for a road maintenance program. And if I'm understanding you correctly, impact fees might help on increasing capacity on existing roads, but it wouldn't help at all for existing maintenance on.
Correct.
Okay. I mean, I felt like we tried to tell people that, but they just got stuck on impact fees. No, pay for impact, use
Right.
impact fees to
Yeah.
do this.
One example I use for that is 2 North is 2 lanes right now. So if it needs to be 3 lanes for additional capacity, it'll pay for that 3rd lane and maybe sidewalks and maybe even storm drainage to accommodate that 3rd lane or something. But you still gotta find a way to rebuild the existing 2 lanes that are falling apart now.
So then, once we know that, then we'll calculate what the fees are and project the revenues based on those fees. And just because we've calculated those fees and that's what they've come out at, that does not mean they're carved in stone. We might look at it and we might come up with that $5,000 street fee and everybody says, that's not gonna fly in Chino Valley. What if we debt fund it instead of cash fund some of it? How does that affect the fees if we spread the debt service payments over time? Or maybe we were too aggressive with our capital program, that's just too much for us to bite off at this point in time. So it is very much an iterative process to go through to get to what we think that we can support, what we can defend with the development community, and what's right for the community, and then that's what we carry forward. So getting into a little bit more detail on some of this, so the first step is what's the town's projected growth over the next 10 years? What's your current level of service? Is that the level of service that you want going forward? As Andrew mentioned, just because that's your level of service today doesn't mean that's what you have to stick with going forward. You can increase your level of service going forward, but again, you have to have general fund money or some other revenue source to bring up that level of service so that it's not all being done on the back of the development community. What information do you have to support your projects? That's where the master plan helps, but again, if we don't have that, if we've got people that can identify this is a need and this is why we need to do this project, that satisfies that. Master plans,
When you look at your growth,
yes.
how do you calculate in how an impact fee is going to affect the growth?
We have looked at that in some cases before, because certainly from the development community, their stance will be if you put in an impact fee, then growth is just going to completely dry up and move away, and you'll never see another rooftop, another square footage of. So we've got, excuse me, some empirical evidence where we've seen different studies that have looked at that to say, yes, there is this impact, or no, there isn't that impact. Part of it is very much dependent upon, well, if you implement the development fees, how comparable are they to your neighbors? If your development fees are twice as high as your next door neighbor, then yes, it might have more impact than if you're comparable or a little bit lower. We've seen the flip side of the argument to the developers saying that if you implement impact fees, we're never going to build there again. To the other side where we've seen the development community say, okay, well, we actually like this because we know you're investing into the assets that we need in order to make our houses sell, in order to attract business, if you're maintaining your roads, if you're building the water system, if you've got parks that are going to attract families and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of information up there, and some of that comes from I would say the public outreach that we've done too. We often like to have the development communities involved in the process so we can kind of get some feedback from them on if we go down this road, what would your reaction be? They may or may not be honest with us at the time, but it's a little bit more information.
The thing that, and again, hearing both sides of it, if they have bought the land and they've got a development, they're not gonna pick up and go to the other
Right.
town. They're gonna develop there. And the thing with the commercial side is that it really is a small portion of their overall cost of how they make their decisions on whether they're gonna locate or not. It's based on the market. Like when I was in Chandler, we, had a target that wanted incentives to come and locate in Chandler. And we said, you're kidding me, right? Because you're gonna come to Chandler because you've got the market in Chandler, those circles in economic development where you draw and say, okay, this is a draw. And they did, they came and located anyway. When Intel came into town, they could have cared less about all the other fees. They cared about the community, where their people would live, the engineering at ASU? Do you have the water, sewer demand for us? That was just a small portion. We competed against other states to get that big Intel facility, and they did not really care that much about these. So it really depends on, you know, who it is and who's saying, you know, it's gonna affect it affects their bottom line. Sure, when you're selling a house, their profit may not be as high because, you know, it depends on the market, but sometimes their profit's a lot higher than the fees they pay. So it ebbs and flows, and there's a debate on whether or not it has an impact or not. But I just know from experience working with a lot of different commercial developments and big manufacturing and everything in Chandler, everything that's there, it wasn't their number one thing. And on the homes, I mean, the homes still came, and, you know, they built them because the people were there to buy them. So.
So we talked about the master plans a little bit. We've talked about this a little bit too. The ability to finance the non-growth portion of the project. So your hypothetical police station, if you were to build a new one, assuming it's not 100% growth, do you have the financing available, the revenue resources available to fund the non-growth portion of that? And the ability to afford the O&M on a project. We were talking about streets a little bit before, so yeah, you can use the impact fees to expand the street system, but the impact fees can't be used for the ongoing maintenance and repair of the streets, so making sure that you're taking that into account.
The example I like to use is a fire station, because people can relate to that. It's one thing if you use impact fees to build a fire station. I know you're with the fire district, so it doesn't pertain to you, but it costs you another 1.5 to 1.8 million to put firemen in it, and equipment in it, and everything else. And that's why I say always, when you look at any of your CIP projects, you gotta look at the O&M, because that comes out of your general fund. So, yeah, it might be good to build something, but what's the impact, you know, for the future?
Can I ask a question about streets?
Yep.
Currently, when we look at development, say there's a subdivision along an arterial, we're telling the developer that they need to widen out that arterial to the current code and add sidewalks along their frontage. If we did impact fees for arterial expansion, would that conceivably, they wouldn't include that in their development and just pay the impact fees, and we would do the arterials if that's future expansion capacity? It's
Either way.
Or
And-
both?
And what,
Or-
what most cities have done to keep the impact fee number down is to treat a portion of that arterial roadway as the piece that everybody's using to get from here to there, and not the piece that I'm using to get out of my house and go from here to there. And so a lot of times, you know, this is more of in an urban standard, outside lane, curb gutter, and sidewalk usually goes to the developer that has the subdivision. And then middle two lanes and everything else that is more regional goes to the development fee, just because it makes more sense to everybody that you don't want the development fee to be so high for those outside lanes for the developer who's nowhere nearby and isn't going to benefit from them. But if I'm building the subdivision right there, that's my task to build that portion.
Okay.
And they like that better.
They see it as more fair, and they see it as, you know, one property owner then doesn't have a benefit over another, because you're gonna build these in phases. Part of the stakeholder process, and Pat and I have been through probably the most robust one I've ever seen in Queen Creek over the past 18 months or so. And it was really interesting to see the different viewpoints of all the different builders. And these are builders with, you know, 700-800 acres, or, you know, big developments coming in, and they have the land in two different cities, and they're competing against one another. And the one thing they universally all liked was that concept, that on roads, there's a chunk that's gonna get built in front of Corey's place before mine, but as long as I'm not paying for the entire road, then I'm okay with that give and take. But if I have to build everything edge to edge in front of his place, and mine's 7 or 8 years in the future, then I'm not okay with that. And it was really interesting to see that real nuanced position on something as simple as roads, that have that really convoluted, complex formula.
But that also helps stop the start and stop of some of the road construction. I think it was Vegas I was in.
It's awful.
You've got a road that goes from 5 lanes to 2 to 5 to 2 to 5 to 2 because they haven't built everything in between. But I was thinking if you had some sort of development fee, you could have a little bit more cohesiveness.
You at least take care of the regional need, And then when the local person comes on, they take care of the local piece of it.
Yeah.
And that's too the reason why you get the interim roads where it's not quite the full width all the way, and then the outside parts of it come in with the development, and that's when you put in the turn lane in the middle and, you know, allow for a little more traffic load. It's just, it's different for every different property owner and what their needs are gonna be, but that method seems to have been the one that everybody's settled on as being the fair way to do it. Plus it keeps the fee down.
So the IIP, so we've got a few slides on this. We've talked a lot about it already, so I won't dwell on this too much. But your IIP, that's where you need to identify what your current level of service is. You have to decide what your level of service is. Is it police and fire calls? Is it response time? Is it park acres per capita? I've seen it done different ways in different places, so I don't know that there's any one thing that we can pull a book off the shelf and say, this is how you have to define your level of service. But at the same time, it has to be reasonable, and it has to be something that you can defend. So who are you gonna serve over the next 10 to 15 years? So population, jobs, square footage of development, of non-residential development, and various classifications. Still sticking with the IIP, so this is getting into what we touched on a little bit before still, where you're identifying what your existing infrastructure is, what available capacity is there in the existing infrastructure, what do you need going forward, what's your backup or what's your proof that you need this development infrastructure going forward to be able to serve the new development. You need to, the IIP is the most specific part, so it's got all the information in it. It's got your level of service. This has got, we're gonna build this police station and it's gonna serve X population, or we're gonna build this fire station in order to achieve a fire response time of Y. So all that information needs to go into the IIP and how you're gonna pay for it.
This shows how much greater the information is than a normal CRT.
Right, yes. And then getting into the forecast of the revenues generated by new service. So part of what we have to do here is, if as a result of the new development, you're gonna generate more revenue than you're gonna be expending on your O&M. So if you build a new police station and because of the new development, you're gonna be generating more property tax revenue or more sales tax revenue than you're currently spending on your police services, then you need to give a credit back, and it gets very convoluted with that, which is why they recommend hiring outside professionals.
Now, would commercial then fall into that same category then? Could they then prove that we're gonna actually make you money, so
that is an argument that
we
they
have
could
no
try and
impact, in
make.
fact, we are a positive impact?
That's an argument that they could try to make.
Okay.
Yeah, we haven't heard that really from commercial though, because the commercial developers, impact fees are nominal compared to the other things they're interested in.
Okay.
And they really just don't care as much. But yeah, that argument. That argument, and that argument really is, as long as you're not discriminating against that industry, what this provision of statute, the tweak to it, that is almost the way it was before the big change, but the tweak to it is that if you have a new construction sales tax that's higher than your regular tax, you have to apply that delta to capital and offset the cost for new growth. You didn't used to have to do that until Goodyear lowered their property tax and raised their new construction sales tax simultaneously, causing a lawsuit that we defended, they won, then we got the statute. It's kind of how this whole thing works. Bad act, reaction.
You know where we're at, town.
Right here.
About 4,600 feet is what I'm looking at.
Nearly a mile higher.
Yeah, almost. I'll wait till the end.
Sorry, Amy.
I know, I am sorry. I don't know.
I just got some in the truck.
I got some in my desk.
I got some
We have
ibuprofen.
first aid.
Oh, Pat has Tylenol.
I got in trouble for putting
You like
aspirin
Tylenol?
on.
Yeah, you're not allowed to. I don't
I had both.
care. Yeah, I don't.
We just don't know how to administer that.
I'd say.
Not gonna get a lot of headaches.
I don't cause you headaches?
Development.
Okay. So then getting into steps 5 and 6, so that's your financing plan, so your 10-year financial forecast, the best fee methodology, as Pat alluded to at the beginning. We talked briefly about the 3 different types. Again, there isn't a book that we can pull off the shelf and say, oh, if Chino Valley's going with a police fee, this is the methodology that we have to use. We look at, based on the information you have, whether you're growing, your build out, that'll all help us figure out what the best way to do it. And tasked to complete the study, as Pat mentioned, it's a good year to year and a half to get through the process. A lot of it is a result of these hurry up and wait milestones, where we get things done and then we have to wait 30 days, or we get something else done and then we have to wait another 30 days. So the 18 months isn't that Pat and I are constantly number crunching and running things for 18 straight months. There's a lot of lag in here that we have to respect, and we'll certainly help you through it, and we'll answer questions and everything if you have them during that time, but we're not actively working on things the entire 18.
And you look at that scale and you think, well, that doesn't add up to that many days. How do we get to the 18 months? Remember, all these things have to go back to back to back, and they fit into your normal schedule. So if you've got a 60-day notice period, then you've got to figure out where's your next council meeting after the 60-day notice period. And as you just keep accumulating them, we found the shortest period of time is about 275 days from the time you have your studies done, where you've got things you can give them to say, create all of this for us, until you can implement. That's about your shortest time frame.
And getting to the published, the IIP, there's a whole timeline there. A lot of time that we're talking to departments and getting to capital projects and, you know, does it conform to the general plan, the projections and all that? That's leading up to that. So that's just after you've got the IIP developed.
Right.
It's a little.
Yeah, that arrow's a lot longer than
Wasn't big enough.
I have a question. So rural versus more, like growing Chandler or Gilbert, much more challenging or less challenging?
You know, we've done small communities, large communities, mid-sized communities, we've done them all. It just depends on where you're at, like I say, as far as growth and everything. Sometimes smaller communities can be more challenging because you get more people involved in it, depends on your community. Other times, like it's a lot of challenge when you have a lot of development going on, like a Queen Creek or a Buckeye or something. We built the Anheuser-Busch facility with developers when we went with Buckeye. It was so huge, so many people turning out. So of course, if you've got a lot of development going on, you're gonna have more players in it that are gonna be in it. But that doesn't mean it's not that any less controversy, or that you have to work with the development community or the valley or the partnership group, commercial representatives, or the Home Builders Association up here. I forgot what they're called, but you have a separate thing.
Yeah, Pike County.
Yeah.
Contractors Association.
And to Pat's point, some of the times when we're working with the bigger municipalities, they've got more people involved on the city side too, so they've got more people doing an individual job, as opposed to smaller communities. You sometimes have the same person wearing multiple hats, so you can go to one person and get the answer to 3 different questions, versus the bigger, oh, you need to talk to so-and-so. No, I'm not the right one, you need to talk to them. Oh, no, that's not my job anymore, so it all depends. So then this is another kind of walkthrough of the steps to get through the development impact fee process. And then we'll run through the objectives pretty quickly here. So if we were to do the study for you, this is kind of the process that we would go through, where we'd have the kickoff meeting, discuss roles and responsibilities, talk about the project timeline, even though that's going to be in flux, as Andrew said, depending upon council meetings and when things go and what date is available to us. The data collection, compilation, and analysis, so reviewing the preliminary data request, that's part of the kickoff meeting, making sure everybody understands what we're looking for and what we need. The development of the land use assumptions, so again, this is going back to basically your growth projections, and starting off with either census data or county data, and And then that's where Pat and I kind of get in there and start asking questions and making challenges. And, well, if you've only grown by, 100 homes over the last 5 years, what makes you think you're gonna start growing by 500 homes the next 3 years? A year kind of a thing. Again, we're not gonna have all the answers for you, we're just kind of there to challenge you and hopefully get the best information available from you, maybe think of some different things that you're not thinking of. Developing the IIP, and these things are reviewed with everybody all throughout the whole process, so, part of the reason that Pat jokes that I need to have a second house out here in Arizona is because I don't just go back to Denver. You don't see me at the beginning. I take all the information, hide in my office, and come up with an answer, and then give it to you at the end and say, here you go, here's your answer. Pat and I are very hands-on, and we're out all the time, making sure that we have the information and that we understand what it is you're looking for, and you're understanding what it is we're doing. So getting into the calculation of the fees, the revenue credits, we talked a little bit about the survey of impact fees for comparable communities. Pat and I always provide the caveat that we're not developing Chino Valley's fees for Prescott Valley, or for Prescott, we're developing the fees specific to Chino Valley and what Chino Valley's needs are. But at the end of the day, the question always comes up, well, how do we compare to Prescott and Prescott Valley and all of our neighbors? So we like to do that just to give you more information on what it is that's going on there.
Can you ever get to apples, or is it sometimes difficult?
It is incredibly difficult to get to a true apples to apples comparison.
Even next door neighboring
Yeah.
communities
Yeah,
are.
we've always had trouble making sure we had everything incorporated in the comparisons. It seems like there's,
Well, water and sewer is a classic example
Yes.
of that. I mean, because of the fact that, different treatments, different demographics, geographic, and whether or not
Densities,
you
right.
have water and sewer with, you have to do backflow, projections and things. I mean, it's just so much more that can be from one community to the next. You have to treat, like Goodyear has more salt in their water, they have to have higher treatment standards, and pumping uphill versus downhill and things like that. So it's very, very hard. We always caveat it, but we try to give some information on, this might be why there's this difference here. Prescott has this, Prescott Valley has that, and this is why yours might be different than theirs,
Right.
as examples.
Prescott Valley's police response time is 5 minutes, Prescott's police response time is 3 minutes. We try and, to the extent we can get that information, we try and provide it to you, but to get to an exact apples to apples, I don't know that we've ever been able to do. Stakeholder meetings, so again, this is something that could extend the timeline in terms of how long the process takes. We've worked in some places where they had no interest in engaging the public or the development community. And then we've had the other ones, the Queen Creek that Andrew mentioned, where there was a dozen or so public outreach meetings where we were walking the development and the interested parties throughout every step of the way, so they understood what we were doing. And it gave them a chance to ask questions along the way, as opposed to trying to ambush the council at the end and say, we weren't involved and we didn't understand this and we disagree. So that's a matter of preference of which direction you want to go in. And then the reports and the presentations. So again, walking through all the individual pieces and how we got to where we are. It's a similar type thing where I don't go back to my office and hide out there and just give you something at the end. It doesn't do any of us any good if we just drop a report off at the end and we're not there to answer questions and explain how we got there and the steps that we went through, and making sure that everybody knows what went into it and that it's fully vetted and everything that was done. And then some changes to the publication requirements.
Senate Bill 1525, I partially changed it, that became 946305, but it was Senate Bill 1525 that was introduced that changed everything in it.
And you have a website, so you have to publish it. You have a pretty good website.
we do.
Or usable.
Thank you.
Compared to some, it's really usable.
We have a lot of information on our website.
You do.
Really good, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so this is getting into some of the stuff that Pat touched on earlier, that if you do implement fees, then you have to document what you've done, how you spent the money, what revenues you collected, all that kind of stuff, so that it's not going into a black hole. There's,
They don't have any grandfather.
no, there wouldn't be.
It's, the process for grandfathering actually isn't from the most recent change, it's from 2 statutes before that. And the idea was, and we thought it was a reasonable one, the developer said, look, we get financing based upon what we're doing in a certain period of time, so you can't change the fees on us in the middle of it, because we already got our loan. So the 2-year kind of rolling frozen period works as, you know, if, the only time someone would ever get a full 2-year grace period on it was if they were day one. They got their approvals one day and the next day you adopted new fees, they would get a full 24 months, but it's 24 months or less. So that if I'm building a subdivision, I've taken my loan out, now I know that for the next 24 months or whatever the period is, I can rely on that number. It's been more challenging to implement than we ever thought it would be, but it's still something that's important to people, that you don't change the rules of the game midstream.
But shouldn't that period be up even for the counties now?
No, that's rolling. This is in for any development.
Or?
If
Oh,
I get a
okay.
subdivision approval tomorrow, and
Yeah,
then you
okay, I
change the
get it.
fees 3 days after that, I've got 3 days less than 24 months.
It works for even a change of fees, okay. I caught up.
How about implementing?
You keep going, I'll catch up.
I'm building a subdivision.
There's
And
no,
then
gr-
impact fees come a year and a half later before I'm done building my subdivision.
yeah, there's no grandfather to zero. That wasn't ever really contemplated in it.
So it's once you pull a building permit,
Yeah, once you
it's passed.
So what you generally will see is if you're going to implement a fee and somebody's in that middle stage, they'll pull a bunch of permits earlier than they want to.
That happened to us last time, they did tons of permits before.
So you get this big influx of building permit fees, and then people sit on them until the very end of their period.
You have an expiration date.
All right, we've had lots of good questions along the way, but certainly if there's other ones and we didn't touch on something, we're happy to try and answer them the best we can.
It's just, it's so complicated, so I have to ask this. So we already have buy-in fees for water and sewer. So would that be something that we shouldn't really consider at this time and look at other fees? Focus on some of the others, or?
As long as you feel that the methodology ties to the fee and that you're recouping what you should be in order to be able to provide the capacity for the future, I think you're fine with that. You wouldn't need to do it. I would say the other ones that you don't have in place at all. Because every permit that's pulled now, you know, the way I look at it is you're really decreasing your existing citizens' service level. Every time somebody new comes to town and you're not getting any money from them to participate in, you know, maybe some things that had to be built because of growth, you're decreasing your existing. So that's kind of one of the ways to look at it, is it's really helping out the people that are here today, because somebody's gonna have to pay for it. You know, if you wanna build things, somebody's gonna pay for it. So why wouldn't it be the demand that's placed on the system, no matter what it is, as a result of growth?
So there's ongoing costs auditing constantly of this. So we would need to look at what our growth rate is, because we could just be nothing but spending money and the whole bookkeeping end of it, more than what we're actually collecting.
You can't put the fees,
Just said
though,
it, we
that
just
for
said it.
future study updates, in the fees, the cost of that, you can include in that for the future. You can't get this, like, if you hired us tomorrow, that can't be recouped back. But for future updates and things, that can be recouped in the fees themselves.
Okay. But we can choose which areas we want to do fees and which areas we don't.
Right.
So therefore, and you said it, the easier ones are, say, police departments, because that's something that is easily spread, calculated, I would think,
System, yeah, usually.
within the system. Where, what percentage of our new permits have sewer, which ones are on water? You know, do we really, with our 100 permits a year, are we really collecting enough to cover the expense of even doing this?
Or do their buy-in fees cover it enough? I mean,
When you mean buy-in fees, are you talking about connection fees?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, those are an impact fee.
yeah, they are, they're just called buy-in fees, but they're not called impact fees.
Yeah, they're not called capacity fees, but that's basically what they are.
Well,
Yeah, that's how we determine.
So if we're already doing that,
That's why I said maybe we don't look at water and sewer at first. Because those who are gonna get on are paying an impact fee or.
already,
And based upon the fact that you have a lot of county areas nearby you, it would make more sense for you to stay in the easier statute for water and sewer, just in case you ended up wanting to serve into some of those areas. Now you don't have the problem of, you know, how and when do
Okay.
we collect it?
Mhm.
Because remember, we collect these at building permit, and you don't collect building permits from people in the county. And so if you have a potentially over jurisdiction system, you wanna keep it on the 9/5/11 side.
So we could still collect connection fee, thank you, without having to tie
Buy-in
it to the building permit.
Right.
Make that one work.
For-
Buy-in fee or connection
We
fee?
call
Yeah.
it volume.
Yeah, one example would be if the
Well,
voters
Yeah,
ever
over
wanted
50.
us to buy Quail Ridge,
Right.
that would be outside the town limits, but
Right.
you could make that inside a water service area.
Exactly.
Since you get
Or,
into the whole.
yeah, or like how Prescott serves inside Chino.
Well, yeah, that's a good point, that specific example is something you cannot do anymore.
Right.
Because of Buckeye bought Global Water, and then was going to use, they were capacity fees.
Yeah.
They were using capacity fees, same thing, buy-in fees, connection fees, they're all kind of the same. But they were gonna use capacity fees to buy it,
Oh, no, I didn't
that's
say
not-
that.
and that was, yeah, so what you would end up doing is you would have to capital finance in some other way that isn't growth related, the system itself. And then you'd use your
No, man.
regular revenues
Yeah.
to pay for the
Yeah,
opera.
what I was referring to is say we already had a system outside town limits and then a new customer wanted to come in, he would have to pay those buy-in fees.
Right.
And that's what I was referring to.
Right, and some cities actually break them into all three. There's a small connection fee for just tapping the line. There's a capacity fee for the part of the plant, and then there's your actual rates that you pay for what you use. Most cities have thought it's a lot easier, just combine those first two together, and what you pay to tap into the line is the capacity fee as well. You're buying part of the plant and you're tapping into the line.
For the distribution list.
Yeah. And the
Well, where
distribution.
it comes in, if you're inside the limits though, with the sewer plant, is you could have an impact fee town-wide for the sewer plant, even for those homes that are not on the sewer system yet, right?
Well, yeah. Yeah, and that's why
But you
it's,
couldn't go outside town limits.
yeah, it's a little more fair, though, to use the buy-in fee or the connection fee, because it is only charging the people who are directly getting a benefit from it.
Right.
So you never get into that benefit issue.
Yeah, nebulous.
And because if you're gonna charge a sewer development fee for someone in town, you better have sewer available.
Yeah.
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 So if you don't have sewer available, you're gonna then have to carve those people out, and then it becomes odd in how you're distributing it.
But, for example, our police department, we know what our level of service is, we know
Mhm.
how many officers we have, and we know what we need to build for that. But as we're planning this, we're gonna be looking at maybe adding another 25 or 30% square footage for future expansion. One idea was to build a one-story, to pretty much cover everything we have, and have the second story ready to go when the growth hits. Well, that portion, we can charge impact fees for.
But
Yeah.
just that portion.
Just that portion.
I have a couple 2 cents. Maggie, how many permits were pulled for new construction?
Was it what, 539 right now,
What's that?
the permits? We had a,
For new construction.
It's not that high.
No, new construction.
Ben, the data you sent over to Ben, Hooper, Prescott Valley, maybe he didn't,
No, that was for since 2009 to 2018.
so it's, okay.
Oh,
and
so
that's-
we're doing
So that's
just
the
about
average
100
of-
homes a year.
okay.
100,
Yeah.
it was
Yeah,
about 100.
on water and sewer is probably 75 of them, so the rest of them are manufactured homes and septic.
That's what I thought.
That's what you said, yeah.
So,
Okay, so from my understanding of the community, Chino Valley is kind of like the last frontier, other than doing, you know what I mean, and moving north towards Paulton and incorporated areas, as far as development is concerned. We've had a huge influx of growth, in my opinion, it's been a huge influx of growth.
That's a
Very valid point. Yeah.
So,
But that doesn't mean that the new people coming in, the developers and the
Right.
home builders might,
and
that's who.
that's actually part of the reason they were repealed last time is because we had a lot of developers up at the podium. For me, I can't make any money.
I'm trying to build affordable housing. for
Exactly,
young
yeah.
families.
And I will say, we have the perception that we're going through a lot of growth. We don't really have that much growth. I mean, we will always be constrained by water.
Right.
So
And
we,
sewer.
I mean, 100
Yeah.
houses a year isn't a ton, but there is that perception out there. I think generally in this area it's growing.
I think that's why even though you can't get apples to apples, I still think we need to have that comparison between the surrounding communities, because we have to know that to know whether we're way off place or whether we're in there. But I don't see how we can afford not to have impact fees. We're behind the 8 ball on roads and so on and so forth. We can't afford to take on more headache on our shoulders when we can't handle what we've got. So if they're gonna come in and develop, they're gonna have to fess up and pay their way, is the way I see it.
Oh, wow.
It seems like the easiest way though would be just through the hookup fees, more so than going down the impact direction.
We already
For water
get
and
it.
sewer.
For water and
We
sewer.
already
We
do
already
that.
get
Yeah.
But if you're making a development, and we've talked about roads and how bad they are, they should go ahead and pay for part of our roads. If we're making new roads for them,
Yep.
or widening roads for them,
Well, obviously in a subdivision, they'll build their own roads,
Well, of
but
course.
yeah, so if they paid the extra capacity, that we would at some point be able to expand or.
You can ask a question.
How
So
many
is that
cities-
automatic? Is that automatic, or is that part of the impact fee?
That's part of the impact, well, in the development, that's part of the development process, is that they're required in the subdivision to put in their own roads and et cetera,
Yeah, and it's not even allowed for an impact fee
right?
for local roads.
Pretty much every road that you would consider your main roads here would be what would be in the impact fees. It's,
All
cause
the
it's
numbered
collector or
roads.
arterial. So all the, 1, 2, 3, 4 north, center, those are the kinds of roads we're talking about.
Now, once we do it, once we take their money, then we have to deliver.
You do, you have to spend.
I don't think we have the discipline to deliver.
Well, you have to, that's what, the discipline has to come on the front end.
Yeah, you already
Your
develop
study
your
has to be
plans.
reasonable, and you have to have plans that you can actually implement within a time period. Because if you have an ambitious plan, you collect a bunch of money and then you don't do anything with it, now you're in that position where someone's gonna come back and want the money back, and you may have that creative class action and be in the position of, now what the heck do we do? So that's part of what we do on a regular basis, is managing the expectations of what's realistic. And it keeps the fees down at a more realistic number
Okay,
than
so
two.
at 100 houses a year, just for example, how do you end up having enough money to, that just doesn't sound like a lot.
That's-
I think you have less. I don't think you have enough to do much of anything. Okay,
Yeah.
because
And
you
I say by the
spend
time you
it.
pay the administration fees that is associated with that,
One-
it's even that much less that we
Well,
have.
and Pat hit it on the head. What typically happens is you debt finance a piece of infrastructure. Like you say, we're gonna do Road 2 North.
And that just pays off.
And
the-
that pays a portion of the cost of 2 North.
Yeah.
It doesn't pay much of it, but it reduces the amount that the taxpayers who are already here have to pay.
Can
And that's generally the way you see it spent.
I ask a question?
That makes sense.
In your guys' experience, have y'all ever started these studies and done like the infrastructure improvement plan, and they realize it doesn't pencil out to charge the impact fees? Have you had that experience yet?
Yeah, we have that, or they'll start in a different fee area, and then we look at it and we say, like Andrew said, we can't, how are you gonna implement this? Do you have the staff to implement? Are you really gonna be able to do this? And they're like, well, no, not really. Or how are you gonna finance it? Do you have you gone out to the voters for DO debt, or you gonna use excise tax bonds and, pledge the impact fee? There's times where people have backed away. I don't know that they've totally backed away from a whole study. Some did. The smaller cities and towns, when this law came out, or 46305, they said it's not worth it to us, kinda like
That's
We
what
did.
we had
where you
said,
guys
yeah.
have done.
That's
Yeah.
what we did.
And, I'll be honest, we're the kind of consultants that will tell you if it doesn't make any
Right.
sense. Dewey Humboldt called me and wanted me to do a study, and I went there and I was like, you have all these projects, well, I don't know where these projects came from, but we're never gonna do those projects. And I said, well, then you can't do an impact fee then, because you don't have any projects for that. And I said, you know, I'm not gonna charge you to do a study that you can't implement, you know? So, I mean, we'll tell you that. If we see something going in that direction, we're gonna say, you know, this doesn't seem like it's justified. I mean, there's work to get there to it, but if we have to stop.
So
I
True
saw
North is the perfect example, either
Mhm.
way. But Bright Star is gonna build another couple hundred homes on there. You get a couple hundred homes.
At least.
Yeah, you charge them 2,000-3,000 of impact, so let's say we get $600,000. But to improve True North is what, $4 or $5 million? So we're just getting a small, slow percentage of the cost.
Or
to do that road.
extend to north.
Or extend to.
That's a new road.
Because we have direct impact on, from that subdivision up to that road.
There's haystack.
I mean, it's not gonna solve our problem, it's not gonna pay for the roads percent, but it'll help. I mean, it's gonna generate some funds.
May
we
help
can
pay
use.
for like a multi-use pathway or a portion of it.
Yeah.
Okay, but still, we've gotta get to a point to where we know how we're going to do what we went out for our bond on. We need to figure out how to have a maintenance program for our roads before we're gonna be able to utilize the little bit that we get from the impact fees, correct?
If I
Yeah,
may.
cause you can save them up for a couple of years and then do, you know, from the highway to the Safeway driveway for 300, 400.
Or, yeah, you just pay, take out a geo bond or some kind of bond, and then you pay, your user impact fees to pay that off over 10 years.
A portion of it, yeah.
Yeah.
But we
Because-
still have to pay a portion too.
And that's
Yeah.
part of the challenging that Pat and I would do if we're fortunate enough to work with you on this. If we're looking at things and you're building 100 rooftops a year and you come back with, well, we've got a $500 million streets program, Pat and I are gonna say, we're not engineers, but is this really reasonable given the amount of growth that you have going on, so. I know you had a question, you.
Yeah, well, like, Ms.
No, go ahead, I'll go ahead, I'll wait.
Go ahead, please.
Me? Everybody around us has impact fees, is that correct? Or we're the only ones that don't?
Prescott and Prescott Valley.
Prescott and Prescott Valley do, who else are you talking about?
Well,
Ashford
around us.
doesn't have any.
The county have? Does county have them?
No.
Well, I don't know if you're counting.
I don't think so.
Dan Cherry says no. Last time. we
What's
did.
that?
Prescott Valley did.
Yeah,
County
Prescott-
does
Prescott
not.
Valley does.
Does or does not?
Prescott
Prescott
Valley
Valley
has
does.
street, parks and rec, police and
They have a really
library.
interesting
and
And,
Prescott
and
has
what is,
police and library.
what's the ballpark cost of this study?
It depends on how many fee areas you want.
Yeah.
If you look at streets, it's probably the most complex.
Just a ballpark.
$5?
$5 or $500,000?
No, not $500,000.
Well, I'm saying just a ballpark.
$100,000 for the areas that you're looking at. but we
Under
have-
100?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then what is the process, the implementation, how do you get it started? Does it have to go through a vote, or is it
No,
just
it's
a,
But vote by council.
that's it?
So out of Arizona, what percentage of, would you say have impact fees versus don't? 50, 40, 30?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'd say the majority of the big cities have them.
Yeah.
And, the smaller cities, it depends, like, you know, there's a lot of them that do, but there's a lot of smaller cities that don't. It's, you know, I mean, we're talking about some cities are 300 people
Yeah.
and some cities are
Yep.
5,000 people, and it just doesn't make sense, like the Mammoth, Arizona Copper Corridor, the Kearneys and those, I mean, it doesn't, they're losing population, they're not gaining it. So it depends on what city you're looking at.
It depends upon if they're growing.
Yeah, if they're growing or not.
The size of the city doesn't necessarily mean as much as where it is. So if you're in a growth area, you'll have development impact fees because you can't keep up. If you're in a no-growth area, even if you're a sizable city, you may not have them at all. You know, Kingman doesn't have them at the moment. They had them for a while
Till the legislation.
until the
changed.
legislation changed, and they punted theirs at the same time because they had other issues as well. of
But
not-
they're looking
But they're
at it now.
undertaking
But
a
then-
study
yeah,
right
they're
now.
go- they're going back to the well
Going
again.
back to it, but you know, like the Youngtown,
They're growing.
Arizona, does everybody know where Youngtown
Mhm.
is? It's a
Mhm.
small community, they had impact fees, but when the law changed, they went away, cause they're not growing, they're just not
Yeah.
growing
They're
at all.
landlocked.
So
Tempe
Vice
has
Mayor
got
Miller, I
them,
think,
but they're going up.
we need to look at our growth projections and then look at the categories that you guys might be interested in.
But I think also our growth projections will change drastically if we could
get a leg of a water and sewer down and then use impact fees to extend it on to another area, then that would grow.
See, but I don't know what percentage, for instance, if there's 100 homes a year coming in, at $5,000 a home, that's $500,000. But that $500,000 needs to then be split between whether we include the police department, and then the roads, and then the sewer, then the
Parks.
water,
And parks.
parks. Well, that 500, we just now have got to show that we have projects in the 5 different sectors that's going to, and that can only be a percentage, justifiable percentage of those projects.
Correct.
That,
Maybe you just pick a few categories,
Mhm.
like streets and police, and limit it to those, maybe. I mean, that's up to you guys to decide.
Okay.
You don't have to do them all. And water
Okay.
and sewer, you don't wanna touch.
Yeah, if we
So-
already have the connection fees for water and sewer, just leave that one alone.
So, yeah, you just
And
need to
focus
determine
on
the
the
categories
others.
council wants to look at, and
But
then
if
we
we
can get a
were,
quote.
if we were to get in that
Maybe
500,000 a year, it would free our budget up by 500,000
yes, but it also commits us to doing projects.
down the road.
And,
in 10
and then
years.
do you look at, okay, that 100 homes is now what percentage of the town population? So that's their percentage towards a
So you're
project.
saying we're getting $500,000 in profit, but the burden might be 4 times that's what you're saying.
Exactly. Or
More.
more.
Yeah, just throwing out
Yeah, but they're
numbers.
Right.
still
It would be
coming, the burden's still coming.
No matter
And,
what.
Right.
and I think
So
what
it's
you,
still there,
Exactly.
I mean,
I think what you said earlier is that, say for example, if it's $500,000 in impact fees, that growth is still there, so now without that 500,000 of impact fees, the level of service for everybody has gone down.
Absolutely, if you bring in more people.
or the cost of service goes
And
up
500,000
for
could
everybody.
fund some $5 million worth of bonds, you know?
Right,
You're not even talking about commercial included in that, which will at some point
Such a-
start to take off out here
additional
as well.
revenue.
yeah, I think that's probably our biggest area of potential growth.
Holy moly, 2 hours on this. You guys done with
On
this?
your watch.
This is important.
No, it is,
Council
but I think
wasn't.
we're at
Vice
a,
Mayor.
I
I
didn't say
think
it
we're at a
wasn't,
point where we need to do some
Councilwoman.
stewing on it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But, you know,
Well,
I don't see
Pat,
the
Kevin,
negative.
thank you very much. I think it was very thorough, very,
yeah, a lot of really good information.
Yeah.
very wonderful job.
So maybe in a month, we'll talk again, and you guys
Mhm.
can give us some idea of what you're thinking, and
well, I would say what I'd want to hear from you, Joe, is, okay, but if we go with that $500,000 off of the 100 homes at $5,000 per home, what dollar projects do we need to
Yeah, and
put
actually,
in place?
going,
Now, bring the numbers to us, because
Starting
again,
the-
I like numbers.
yeah, starting the budget process. This is something, Frank, we can all work on. We'll do some rough growth projections and look at the different categories.
Don't leave Josh out of this. Good.
No, I pointed at Josh too.
Okay.
Yeah.
We got growth projections and all that stuff, I don't know.
Plus, it might
But-
be more than 5,000 per home, right?
Right, right. It
Because
just,
how much is your water and sewer right now?
10.
Yeah.
10 plus.
10,000.
10
So
plus.
you're getting in 10 for that, and your street fee usually is higher, what we've seen in most communities. Police all depends, but,
And then at that point, then we need to do that comparison, like
Right.
Ron said.
right, because they will do the
Well, I
comparison for
can-
you if you don't.
I can
Yes.
put a little summary, I can put a little something together for you guys.
Okay, anything else on that, you guys and gals?
One more quick question, because it's just drive me crazy. One more quick one. So when I'm putting together my, population projections and all of that, is it only inside Chino Valley limits? Or am I dealing with a trade area that I know that we service?
That's your planning area, whatever you
Yeah.
would consider that might be within the boundaries of the town within that 10-year period.
I think you're looking at two different things, though, because you're looking at a service area.
Yeah, that's what I'm
And-
asking, could be service.
Yeah, it has to be within, what's gonna be within the town.
Okay, that's all I need.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, you guys, it was nice to see you.
Safe travels.
Thank you.
Okay, presentation discussion regarding town manager recruitment, Laura Kay.
Can we take a 5 minute?
Take a 5 minute.
After 5 minutes.
Yeah, turn your, start your clock.
You need your gavel.
I got one right here.
Oh, what's missing? Anybody find it yet?
Pay attention.
Is the gavel still AWOL?
Oh, Oh,
I
I
don't know.
wondered if Jamie, did you guys order new gavel? Is she over there?
No, we
Erin?
found it.
Pardon
Found
me?
it?
We found it.
Oh, you did?
Calf month. Accidentally walked away with it.
Oh.
They brought it back.
Those fire
Accidentally, eh?
people.
It was somebody
Accidentally walked away
new,
with
so.
Does it have a band on it that says the mayor?
Oh,
You should engrave
while they're on a
that thing.
5-minute break, from the 4th of July, the,
Hey, you
Rotary
two.
is pretty much gone.
Andrew,
I
Yes, sir.
About
when we make a change,
the line taking over.
like we did last meeting on that, consent agenda A, it'd be real nice to know about that beforehand. Somehow, or something in writing. You know what I mean? Cause I had no idea I still don't know what I made a motion to do. You know, or why.
Whenever we have the chance to tell you ahead of time, we will.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have.
Well, listen, we've done it with a couple other times before too. Since I've been vice, I noticed it.
A couple times it was because the wrong thing ended up in the packet. And we either had the choice of pulling it off the agenda, which Mary didn't.
I just don't want to get under the public to get the impression that you're telling us what to do.
Yeah, that we're doing this.
Exactly. And that's exactly what it looked like.
We will endeavor to not have that be the case.
Yeah, cause I don't want to take you out back and have to talk about it.
Or else we give a longer explanation of why.
Exactly, it's just something, cause the mayor pulled it, he never said why he pulled it. And then Andrew said to make this motion, and it was like, oh, what, you know, it was totally like, blah, 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 blah.
Just following the lead, you didn't know why.
I was Andrew's puppet. I didn't like
Just
it.
to give you a place to go.
I don't think I could pick up the strings.
Oh.
Thanks. Jackson, bigger man than I am. I could not pick up the strings.
Okay, you couldn't pick up mine either, cause you're kinda small.
Oh,
Hey,
He's got the city built.
don't make me take my shirt off.
You have a dog hiding in there?
anyway, it'd just be nice. Cause like I said, I never understood, I don't think anybody understood why we did what we did. We pulled it and then we made a revised motion and it was
You
like,
could have asked right then.
huh?
You could have asked right then.
But
Explain
it
this
just made the
better.
confusion, it would have made the confusion look more confusing to me. You know what I mean? Trying to save face for everybody.
I think we had a meeting right before that, was it the utility or roads? That's when we found out.
Individuals
So it all happened right.
Somebody just wasn't doing their job.
Well, let's blame Frank, 'cause he's not there.
I don't mind blaming him.
He's not sitting right there, and it was his item.
got the bouncy houses with water slide.
The guy who was
I
like,
never throw anybody under the bus. I'm not gonna say anything.
oh, we throw people under the bus all the time.
Because
Tell me who's fair game, you know?
Frank.
Frank is always one.
Frank is the one we pick on. Frank is.
so, I mean, I would.
If he's not, he'll tell you what happened anyway.
Sorry.
I'll come back.
What's the bad thing?
Learn that you're fair game and throw under the bus.
Bye, drive safe.
Thank you.
Like your slack. I'll start putting that to Joe.
It's Frank, it's Frank's meeting. Hey Laura, you have 5 minutes.
Okay. Oh, wow, who died and made you mayor?
Well, I tell Lori what to do all the time.
Do you know Doug Woods? Do you remember Doug Woods?
Make a small piece about 30
Prescott Valley, we were this little county, town start.
Well, it was Dagwood.
And there was an area there, so they were building.
You don't know Doug Woods?
And there were like 13
Hey, Lon.
houses. That's
Lonnie.
like wild. And he
Do you remember Cecilia? Do you remember Doug Woods?
Pardon me?
Doug Woods? He was a cop in Chino for way back.
Doug Woods? I don't remember. Wow. How long
Oh
ago?
my God.
Because they're building
Was he a cop?
No, yeah, how long was he there?
If you want the inlay.
15, 10, 15.
You wanna build out there, that's where you
He got, lost his thumb or finger and had to retire because he couldn't fall.
Oh, I remember somebody that, okay.
He died. He's dead. He's not with us. He quit breathing, and then his heart quit, and then the blood quit circulating, and then all his tissues surmised. That's usually how it works.
It's always
Nothing to do with his thumb. He fell off the roof and landed on his head.
You know, we have people.
Got a bleed, and then they took his scalp, took his skull cap
They
off,
don't
and
get
then
their
to let his
motorcycle
brain
out and ride down
expand.
the road, you know, to come here, as we're having it in Arizona.
Do you remember Doug Woods, the
Yes.
cop? He's dead. He died 2 days ago.
Really?
Fell off the roof and hit his head and got a bleed.
Yeah, I told this cow, you don't know if it's true.
I figured you'd remember, cause he was on the streets we used to.
Mm-hmm.
I thought you were gonna say Long's been arrested by him like 5 times.
What's that?
Were you arrested by him about 5 times? Is that
No.
why you remember?
I don't think, were you ever arrested in Chino?
Arrested?
Yeah.
Convicted?
Oh, were you really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, once.
Really? I
It
never,
was gonna happen twice.
I never.
You know, I figured, it was kind of one of those things, you know, you don't complain, because, you know, that's one time for all the times you got away with it. So-
Okay, folks, let's go.
I filled out my application with Cecilia. Have you been convicted of a crime? Convicted? No.
Well, yeah, that's true. Arrested and convicted is two different stories.
Just don't ask any more details. Still there.
Yeah, the first time I ever heard that one, I was like about 13. My uncle pulled up.
Okay, Laura.
So I'm gonna just start it off a little bit.
You're not Laura, ma'am. You're not on the agenda. I'm sorry. Silencio.
So a couple months ago, when I was doing my review, it came up that, council had gotten wind that I had talked about retiring, which I had. And so I'm looking at March of next year, that'll be my retirement date. So it's still a little ways off. And, since I've been here, I've had probably 5 or 6 different managers. I think different people have been hired in different ways. At that time in the executive session, it was mentioned, like, what are we gonna do for succession planning? So this is Laura's and my discussions is kind of culminated in this. This is our first discussion with the council on what that could look like. We have plenty of time, so let's not get too excited over some of the details. Let's talk it as much as we can at a high level. The mayor's looked this over. I just had him with his HR background, and he's like, I'm fine with it. Obviously, he's not here tonight to help walk through this process, but I think there's a whole bunch of different ways we can address this. This is our first stab at what the recruitment might look like, and we'll just start the discussion and see what you guys want to do. So, I'll go to Laura to talk about how that's gonna work.
Okay, thank you, Cecilia. So this, timeline is a 1-page timeline. And it will give you basically a 30,000-foot overview of what the town manager recruitment process can look like and how long it may take. Cecilia's given us a gift, and that gift is the gift of time, with this extensive notice. So, we're able to make a thorough evaluation of our needs and make a final selection of the next town manager. So this is basically an overview of all the things that we're gonna do to get to the point where we actually extend a job offer and a new town manager starts. And I have it starting in February of 2020 and finishing in February of 2021. So there is a lot of wiggle room here, but it gives us that opportunity to take our time and really focus on candidate profiles, the selection process, all that good stuff. So the first step in the process, on the timeline, it'll tell you what the step is, and then next to it, in that column, is the allotted time that I've given to it. The first step is develop an ideal candidate profile. Know what you want. Ways to do that is primarily creating discussions. So we would meet with the town council to discuss job specifications, to detail the exact education, experience, knowledge, skills, abilities, and other requirements that are needed. What does the town council want? What does the town council need? What does the town council not currently have that they want? Where is that gap? What is the town's vision and upcoming goals and objectives? And what kind of town manager do we need to help us lead us in that direction? We can also meet with key staff, because the town manager deals so closely with staff and council that it makes sense to start the conversations on both sides. So you're having the same conversations with key staff. and what the needs are and wants are of the staff. Other things that we can look at when we're creating that candidate profile is it helpful to have a town manager that has historical knowledge? How much understanding do they need of the local area? How much understanding do they need about the state of Arizona? Do they need great delegation skills? Do they need to be a liaison between town council and staff? Is it important to have an extensive experience working with public entities and municipalities? What kind of experience and knowledge do you want them to have in land development, economic development, public works, public finance, public HR, with the town clerk? Do they have to have great communication skills? Do they need to be able to develop staff for future succession planning? And do they need to focus on production and what kind and how much? So those are the things that you need to kind of think about when we're creating that candidate profile. And again, like I said, filling in the gaps that you feel currently exist and what we need to focus on to make sure those gaps are filled if there are any. And also looking at what has not worked with past managers. I mean, we've had some past managers, and I think there's been a bit of turnover in the town manager position. I think it's normal, but at the same time, we've had some really successful town managers and some not so successful town managers. And why did we have those not successful town managers? And what leadership skills are needed to continue supporting the healthy culture that currently exists with the town? When I started 5 years ago, we did not have the corporate or company culture that we currently have. We're truly live by our core values, and we are one town, one team. And if we want to keep that going, what kind of leader do we need in that position? And with all that, we can create our candidate profile and update the job description. So that, I'm allotting 2 months to that. So the next step would be.
Cecilia, if you could just get on that.
Remember, she said there's gaps there that you guys can say.
Only if you think there's gaps.
I'm like, what, you have a month? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, what's our plan for accomplishing that one?
So this is basically the candidate profile. This is
Yeah, but-
basically right now, I'm giving you an overview of all the steps. And then, once we get into accomplishing those things, typically with a position at this level, it's very typical to hire an executive search firm. This type of recruitment is a lot different than hiring a roads maintenance person or an administrative tech. It takes a lot of assessment of the position, creating selection process, having written exercises, interview panels, meet and greets, all kinds of things. So the next step, after I've reviewed all this with you, is then we delve deeper into the steps with an executive search firm.
An executive what?
Search firm?
Okay.
I think
So
we
the
need,
next-
I think we need a detective. I wanna go all the way back to first grade and find out everything we did.
So the next step would
Then I wouldn't
be,
have been hired.
after a candidate profile, is you develop a selection process. And with the selection process, that's your who, what, when, where, how of the selection process. Do you wanna create interview panels that are a combination of town council and staff? Do you wanna create written exercises? Do you wanna have oral interviews with an interview panel? Do you wanna create your Q&A with the public? Do you wanna have a meet and greet? All that stuff is what you are doing during the selection process. And we create a timeline with that. So the next step after that is, once you know what you want, you know how you're gonna do it, then you develop a recruitment and advertisement material. What types of material do you wanna utilize to promote the position and promote your town? Typically, when you use an executive search firm, you can use their network and websites to attract candidates. So that would be the next step. After that, you start recruiting. You actively start recruiting for prospective candidates. Now, there's two ways you can go about recruitment. You can go external or internal, or you can do a combination of both. If you go external with an executive search firm, you're looking at probably anywhere from $15,000 to $20,000. If you decide to go internal with an internal candidate, it's important that you already have a succession plan in place and you have candidates that are interested and are already developed and qualified to step into that role, and in this case, within a year's time. There's cost involved with an internal succession plan, because if you take somebody internally and promote them into the town manager's position, it leaves an opening that you still have to fill. And you also have to focus on developmental training for your existing staff. Right now, we don't have a formal succession plan in place, so it may be that if we have internal candidates that are interested in this position, they can utilize the external route, and we can do like a hybrid for them. And simultaneously, what I'd like to do is, moving forward, maybe for not this replacement, but the next one, we create that developmental program that's more formalized for internal succession. So, so the next step after that would be to review and pre-screen applicants. We can do this a number of ways. HR and the executive search firm can do it for you. We can, based upon your candidate profile and your requirements of the position, we can separate the applicants into yes, maybe, and no. Or if you want to see them all, you can see them all. Whatever you want to do, we can accommodate. It's typically easier if you tell us exactly what your needs are through the candidate profile, and then we do the hard work for you. And then we bring you the top recommended candidates. And then you decide who you want to interview. And then we start the selection process. So in row 2, when we created that selection process, then we, HR and the executive search firm, administer the selection process that you gave us direction on. After that, we make an offer and start contract negotiations, and during that time we do, it's basically a conditional job offer where we're doing pre-employment drug testing, background checks, all that good stuff, and we finalize the contract and then they come on board. And I'm anticipating, I don't know how long you want the overlap to be, but probably it shouldn't be too long. 2 weeks, if that.
Probably 2 years.
Yeah. So this is just a quick overview. I actually did reach out to 3 executive search firms, and the reason why I have the fees anywhere between $15,000 and $20,000 is because that's what I got. And actually, the executive search firm that I actually am interested in, they charge $14,500. And the individual that would head up this search, she was a human resources director for a municipality in Arizona. So she has an HR director background. She worked with a municipality, and she has good knowledge of recruitment at a high level. So that is the overview.
I know you got something to say. I saw you shift in your chair at one
I
point.
know, I saw that too.
It was very obvious.
Got a lot of tells.
Don't
Wanna play poker later?
I still wanna know what the plan is for the number 1 box.
We can do a number of things. I can do group meetings with a couple of town council members, and just talk to them in private about what they want to see, what they like about the existing town manager, what
Nothing.
they think is maybe needs to be improved upon.
Everything.
Based upon our vision as a town, what do we see the town manager needing for the future? That kind of thing. We can do small groups. I can do it with town council, or I can combine it. I can do department heads with town council members combined if you want.
Just for you guys to kind of
We can-
decide. how
I
you-
have some input on that. I have a real problem with a subordinate picking their boss. A real problem with it.
I think it's actually a good idea to have the department heads,
Okay, I'm just
provide
saying,
their
I
input.
have issue with that.
Only because, they work so closely with the town manager. I think it's, if we're gonna have a cohesive team, I mean, having their input, the department heads giving you their input of, I think this person would work really well with the team because they have this, and this.
They can have input with
So-
us, that's
Yeah,
fine.
yeah.
It would not be
That's
our,
decision.
it would
Okay.
only be a
Well,
recommendation
at one point you
on
were
our
reading,
part.
you said a review board of department heads or staff or, and that's where I have an issue. No,
Okay.
me.
And you can, we can accommodate anything that you want, but I highly recommend getting input from department heads so you have an understanding of what has worked really well with them currently, and what they would like to see moving forward. Because right now Cecilia's a liaison. She works so well with department heads, and I feel like she works so well with council that she
I
is
think you can
that
make that statement
coordinator.
correctly.
She
about her
coordinates
working well
things
with
really
council.
well. I'm sorry? I'm sorry?
I don't think you can make that statement about her working well with council.
As a outside party looking in, it appears.
Well, you ought to
as
see it
No.
from my side.
Something that I requested, and that was, I would like to actually have an executive session. And the reason why, and it was kinda, I was told why not, but I'm gonna make another run at this, is that I think as council, we don't wanna be reviewing our department heads in an open meeting as far as where areas that we need, to me, the town, the areas that we, boy, I'm really stumbled here.
Issues
As we pick a town manager, we may see some weaknesses in some of our department heads now, and that we want to then say, this is the direction we wanna go, this is the focus that we really think we need in a town manager. But I don't wanna be talking about department heads in public. And that's why I think a executive session would be an appropriate place for that.
If you are going to do a discussion, one of the 7 ways you get into an executive session, number 1 on the list is personnel-related matters. And it's personnel-related matters for people that you appoint. So that's essentially the town manager, the town attorney, and
Magistrate.
judge. So about the only 3 that you really can go into e-session on. So you certainly have that ability. If you have particular people who you are going to discuss their job performance in the e-session, you have to give them notice, but this isn't really that. This is more of a, in the next manager, we need these skill sets because this plugs gaps that we currently have, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you can identify that without having to go specifically. You can say, somebody that has a strong background in public works development. So maybe you're emphasizing, or something with a management skill that you're looking for. I think that has to be defined. Am I going in the right direction?
You can have that discussion in the e-session to get that level of discussion about what our manager needs to be and why. You can't make any decisions in there, obviously. It's more just
Discussion.
that kind of discussion. But if you have a specific person that you're going to talk about their performance, like if you're going to talk about Cecilia's performance, you have to give her notice of it and give her the opportunity to make you say it in public.
So what
This-
about
this
if it's
statute.
like me? They wanna talk about me. They would have to give me notice and say, we're
They-
gonna talk
they
about you.
can't talk
So
about
they
you.
cannot, the only
No.
3 people they can talk about, is the attorney.
But we
Town
can
manager
discuss her management
judge.
of Laura.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
Exactly.
That's a performance aspect of the manager.
And I think
Or-
that's where Corey's going, is he wanted to say, Cecilia, you really missed it with Laura, she just lollygags and goes out drinking all the time at lunch and, so we could say we wanted somebody to improve their next job that would stop her from drinking and being drug addict on her bicycle all the time.
You can't really go that route, but you could tell your manager that, or, you know, give direction that in the next recruiting, we think these are the areas we need to shore up.
Okay.
And so the next management recruit that we're looking at, we wanna emphasize these things in the process.
Yeah.
And you'd wanna have Laura involved in that discussion, because you want her to hear what you need, so that then when the first things you see include those characteristics.
Gotcha.
Yes,
They're
yes,
emphasized.
one more year.
I know.
Well, it doesn't sound like that's gonna happen anyway, so.
Oh,
it's
stop.
Right after three new people. Oh.
I know. Maybe
So
it's because of
you
it.
guys
So that was
voted.
yes on
Yes.
an executive session.
Yeah, if we keep it focused to that, I think it's fine.
Okay, but if since you volunteered to be the,
I'll be.
that we could say,
Sour cream.
I think we need to focus in an HR, you know, because I think that's where the town really needs some more outside help than what we have.
Okay, so
Yeah.
how do you do that so it's not just Cory saying it? Cause you
Well,
can't vote.
Well, but that's the point of having the people, like, you're gonna be
So I
guiding
gotta
the
sit
process.
and listen to all this.
You gotta sit and
tell
listen
me
to all
how-
this, yes.
Great.
Or you could just stay longer and we don't have to do this.
True
I'm
statement.
voting. Yeah, I'm voting.
Oh, okay.
Congratulations on the new grandbaby.
Oh, thank you.
I think.
Well, you would recommend Laura being in on that.
Yeah, you can have that level of discussion prior to the recruitment process, say, look, this is what we wanna see coming out of it. And everybody in the session has to maintain the confidentiality of what's in there, so it's not gonna be that any of that can be discussed outside the session. And it's the people who are in the room, the only people allowed to be in the room are the ones that you think are required to be there. And certainly if she's gonna be the focal point of your entire recruitment process, she needs to understand what your goals are right up front. And helping you give her the impact, the input she needs for box one might start off that way, but then there's gonna need to be follow-up with folks to flesh out what it is you're looking for. That certainly has been a process I've been involved in before, where we've done that.
Does anyone else, you know, council people, is that something that you would be interested in?
Put in.
I think Cecilia would first and foremost have the most knowledge of where the gaps are that we would be looking for when it came to management of the different departments, strengths and weaknesses. I would love the idea of meeting a few at a time to go over what we think would be best as far as a new town manager. And I'd be willing to baptize Cecilia if I have a hand. She can just stay a little longer.
Are you saying meeting publicly or privately?
Privately, that's what.
Okay.
Yeah.
As
E-session.
in
No,
e-session?
No. Well, I meant.
No, I'm just talking about
with
the
Laura.
e-session. Is this something that you would be open to? To where basically we have just council members and Laura?
And
And
Cecilia.
Cecilia.
You have to have me.
Okay.
It'd be more
You're
efficient
talking
that
about
way.
me.
Or I could do it
No,
in
we're not.
small
We're just
groups,
talking
but
about your
then
position.
two council
No, my
members wouldn't know what the other two said, so maybe the.
And then getting
Group
justification, it comes
executive
back,
session.
oh yeah, that's a good point, and I didn't think.
Yes, you can
it's-
expand on,
okay.
I didn't
Yeah.
think about it.
That allows us to talk through Cecilia then at that meeting.
You have the initial discussion,
Okay.
but you can't really violate the open meeting law by going through her afterwards. So the initial discussion will then lead to the smaller group ones, where Laura can then figure out, okay, what is it that each of you, what does that really mean? Can you give me input on that? And then she can come up with a plan from there. But it needs to be fairly narrow on the front end. It's just a discussion of, here are the things that we think are, here are the things that we wish you would have done differently as our manager, or, that kind of context.
Okay.
It's almost
Okay.
it's almost like a review of Cecilia, but not really. It's that narrow.
It would
And
be
then-
that painful.
It will be that painful, absolutely. And then after that, then the small group meetings that are not more than 3 of you together at a time would be the next step.
Does anybody think it's a bad idea?
No.
Okay then, that's
So
just,
if we
go
do
on
this, candidate, executive session and we talk about, you know, how do we, what is our ideal candidate? How do we improve upon the greatness of Cecilia that we already have?
won't be hard.
The executive search firm, the executive
over your
search
head.
firm helps us with
Most
this,
things
so
are.
they would be involved in this, they would be in the executive session with us, because that's what we pay them for. They're the experts in creating that ideal candidate profile, so I think that third party should be there instead of you solely relying on, you know, HR, that's what they do for a living. And that's when we
So
start
you're
paying
saying we
them.
need to bring in the firm that you said you liked the lady of, or what?
She's not my friend, she's a.
I didn't mean your friend,
Oh.
I didn't mean to imply that.
Yes,
just
that
talks
individual
derogatory
would come
all the
in,
time.
and coincidentally, her name's Laura.
I would
She's
think,
out.
I would think after this executive session that then we can move on down to the next box after that.
Yeah, absolutely, this is
And
the.
then,
No, I still don't think you're talking apples to apples.
Yeah, he's saying,
He's not
Corey's
talking
saying
about
it, do
bringing
it,
the-
Corey's saying doing it just us. And leaving that responsibility to you to get that to the person
I can do that, I
firm we
absolutely
hired.
can.
Isn't that what
Um,
you said?
because we may end up deciding in box number 2, you know, that now is then an open conversation,
Okay,
that, yes, going with a local person, you know, or something like that, may be a direction that we decide to go in box number 2.
okay. I
And
will.
then once we get that decided, then we'll, if we wanna go outside, then yes, then we wanna bring in an outside consultant or search person. But that won't be decided till box 3, or whatever it was.
No.
Box
Uh,
4.
No. Box 4, no. That was before that. That's just mentioning it in box 4, but she's already brought them in prior to that.
Okay.
Helping us develop the selection process and,
Development
Which would be
of
two months.
material, yes. Begging works.
so just to clarify, box 1, row 1, we have an executive session and we're talking about your ideal candidate profile. Once we do that, then starting with row 2, development of selection process is where the executive search firm comes in, that's where you would like that to happen. Because we could even have your executive session and then you could meet this individual still while we're in the candidate profile process, so they can give you ideas of what to think about beyond what I've given you or what I can give you. You know, they may even open up another, you know, level of thought that I didn't think of.
Okay.
So I think it could be beneficial to at least give them that opportunity, and if they don't give you anything, they don't give you anything. You at least gave the discussion, you were open to the discussion.
So,
The,
the very bottom, anticipated start date of new town manager. That would, did I hear 2 weeks?
Of overlap, yeah. So it'd be like early March I'll be leaving.
maybe.
I mean,
That's
yeah.
external though, correct? Versus internal?
Yeah, sure.
What if we can't find nobody, you gonna leave anyway?
How? Well, like, let's answer every scenario tonight. Well, if they start like, we can cross those bridges.
So if we don't have anybody, you're out, no matter what you're saying.
No,
Thanks,
we
Cecilia.
can cross those
Let's
bridges.
just-
Let's don't hire nobody.
Save
We can
money.
cross those bridges as time goes on.
Okay.
Give her credit, she's thought of that already.
Anything else?
No,
You
that's it.
good?
I'm good.
Clear as mud?
Clear as mud.
Okay.
So I'm not really clear. Is it okay she can move forward? We can schedule an executive session, but she can also move forward with putting somebody on board.
Doing what?
Put somebody on,
somebody on
I thought
board.
that was after box 1,
Putting somebody on board.
after the E section.
An executive
Okay.
search.
No, that is with the E-section.
Are we hiring inside or outside? Who does she
I
hire?
think
Are
we
there
have to look
any
at both.
insider candidates?
Yeah.
I think you have
Who
to
does
look
she
at
hire
both.
then? The inside person or
No,
the
no,
outside
we're
person?
talking inside promotion. promotion from inside or promotion from outside.
Yes, sir.
But we're not the executive is outside.
I
Well,
think
the
it's,
recruitment goes, it
Both.
could be an internal candidate, it could be external candidates.
I think
That's
the
not-
executive session is just discussing your ideal candidate at that point. And then, you know, once we get to the actual reviewing of candidates, prospective candidates, there may be some internal candidates, and then we'll see, do they meet your profile? Do they meet the knowledge, skills, and abilities, education, experience that is needed for the
Is
position?
the same firm doing both in and out?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what we can do is,
Okay.
because we do not have a formal succession plan, any internal candidates can apply, and we'll do a hybrid recruitment process through the executive search firm, so they can be interviewed or reviewed, just like any other candidate. And then simultaneously moving forward, what I'd like to do is create a more formalized succession plan, so when we get to the next recruitment, not this recruitment, but the next one after this town manager, we're ready to go. We're in a better place to look
And
at
that could be a
internal
while or a
candidates.
couple weeks, you just never know.
Yeah, that's true. Could be. Hopefully more than a couple weeks, but.
Yeah, hopefully.
Cecilia, didn't you have that position before under Michael?
Assistant.
You okay?
You were the assistant,
I
Pat,
see you.
So I was general services under Michael,
Okay.
and then under Robert became the assistant.
okay.
Do you feel that an assistant town
So
manager
you were
is
in a training
necessary?
position more or less.
I mean, I'm not gonna say any position's always gonna be helpful.
Right.
What I was worried about was adding to our FTE count, so because I already had enough, I thought background knowledge, I didn't know that I necessarily needed that's why I wanted to hire an economic development person, so I use that money for economic development and not for an assistant manager. I mean, you can always use a help.
Right.
I think if you have somebody that doesn't come from here, it's not a bad idea if you're gonna look at succession planning of having them hiring an assistant.
That could
There's
even
pros
be a
and cons.
succession plan
Yeah, that could be.
for that particular position.
I say there's a lot to learn about the Chino Valley.
There is.
I would imagine that, the interest in having somebody local would be great, and then having somebody, with, experience with municipalities is extremely important in the state of Arizona, because we're very unique, the state is.
But
So I
still-
imagine that may be,
You still need somebody qualified to do the job. Whether internal or external.
exactly, yeah.
Okay, we done?
So the meeting, it is just executive session with,
Yes.
okay, no outside.
And then we'll go from there.
But we'll put that sometime in February when we have either the work session or
Yeah,
whether or not we have that first meeting. based on
not
the
next
workload.
meeting, but in February.
Okay.
And what I'll do is I will talk to the executive for search firm and have her give me some candidate profile, like verbiage and stuff that we can discuss. So it's prepared.
That's a good idea.
But realistically, we don't have many candidates within Arizona for town managers.
I'm not certain.
Yeah, I'm not certain, and I'll tell you, I mean, I've had a couple people even call me who are from the area that aren't bad.
You may have had some.
No, I have had
Okay.
a couple people contact me that have some potential, and they have been in the area for a while. So I think you might be surprised.
Timing is everything.
Yeah,
Oh,
right
yeah.
after new people are seated.
Now, timing of
Give
when,
you the stink eye.
of who else is looking in the state at the same time you are.
Mhm.
That's always a big deal, of who you're competing with locally. Are people looking to retire and come out here? Are they retiring because they're tired of working and they think this is a coast out job? Or are they retiring from a different line of work and wanna come into this? You have all kinds of factors that go into it, and sometimes your timing's great and sometimes it's not.
With that retirement outlook, you know, picking up somebody like that, that was why I actually got this ball rolling ahead of time. Instead of like say, okay, it's just 3 months from now, that we could actually start, especially if it is somebody that's on a retirement kind of plan, you know, it gives more opportunity, I think, to search.
So, and you can do everything right in your recruitment effort, but there's no guarantees. I mean, there is no guarantees.
We're not scared to fire people around here.
Just takes a while.
But
No, but
the
I
more
don't like
time
starting
you
over.
devote to it, the more successful you can be.
No, I had that happen at my office. I had exactly the same thing happen. The girl that I had in my office gave me 5 months notice. She said, I'm gonna retire. We brought in someone and she trained. She trained for almost 2 months and then just kinda said, look, we don't need both of us in here. I'm gonna go home. If you need me back, you just call me. And, we did that for about a month, but before 3 months was up, that new person was gone.
Yeah.
Joanne came back. She was nice enough. She came right back full time. Said, "Let's get another one in here. We'll start training again." But it was really hard. It was hard. I found that people from outside, and I know that municipal is different than private, but still, people that came in from mainly California, because that's where we get the biggest influx of people, because it's close, but still mainly just a municipality. They're out of LA or whatever. They just have no clue. The people that I got in the office were overwhelmed. And I found that they were used to coming in and having, in a bigger office, they had 3 jobs to do. This, and this, and then it went to the next person.
Yeah.
In my office, you do
Actually, when we
everything.
recruit for leadership, we tend to run into that too, like,
It
oh,
is
I
tough.
ran utilities and that's all they did. And I'll say, I mean, it is a hard job because we don't have a lot of staff, so you don't have a lot of support staff, and you do end up doing a million different things, and everybody can say that within their departments.
So one of the big differences between the last town manager and this town manager is,
Male, female.
that was big. Okay, that was
I didn't think we were allowed to say that. Oh, she can, okay.
I identify as female.
in my opinion, is the leadership skills, and I know some people don't like this word, but it's the soft skills, the listening, the communication, Cecilia can take a hard line with us, but
Oh, yeah.
take it because we respect her and trust her, because she's always,
Right?
has been truthful with us. So, I mean, so
Our
those
evaluations are
kinds of
coming up.
soft things, I think are important as well. So, it's made a big difference. I can see it in the staff, I see it in the last 5 years, I've seen such a
doesn't
difference
give
in
it up.
staff
You're
because
younger
of
than
the
I am.
leadership
I
skills.
won't either.
And
Well,
those soft skills,
Thanks,
they
Honesty
sound
is
silly, but
huge.
they go such a long way.
It's huge.
We're one town, one team. We truly live by our core values. Whereas before, it was a joke. Now, I mean, it's serious business.
Yeah.
Staff will wrangle you in and, tell you, you're not being part of the team. And it all starts from the top down.
Yeah.
And it has made a difference.
Yeah, and in fact, the last few hires we've made, we've hired them with their culture, the culture being one of the biggest criteria, not just their technical skills. And I think it's made a huge difference. Our culture, compared to where it was when I started 7 years ago to today, I mean, it's not perfect, but man, we have made a huge strides. And we have people working together a lot better now, and it's a real positive place to work as an employee. And so we're hoping that
So why are you leaving?
Yeah, I have no friggin' idea. It's the best place she's ever worked. It's the best place I've
30
ever
years
worked.
or something.
Yeah, it's crazy, but we need to, from the staff's perspective, it's very important that we keep, that, when you guys select her replacement, that we bring that culture as a big part of it, to continue, because everybody's working so well together.
So Jack, I can appreciate that you don't want the subordinates hiring somebody, but you also don't want all your staff to leave. So, I mean,
$1 what?
you don't want all your staff to end up leaving either, so.
No,
When
no,
you
that's
get
true.
with the benefits that are now out there, I'm not too worried about it.
But
So
I'm
they
saying,
say-
we got enough ranking officials nearby that can come and do a review board.
There's a word for it, and I can't remember the word off the top of my head,
Everybody,
but
if you like.
when people are paid fairly and receive benefits that are fair, it becomes a non-issue for them. It's everything else that you do that matters. So if you're paying them fairly and giving them good benefits, great. But then all that goes away and it does not matter anymore. All that matters is the respect, the trust, how you treat them, all that stuff is what becomes important because they can get good pay and benefits elsewhere. That's like almost the core.
What did you just say, though, Corey?
I think the employees here in town compared to public is a pretty sweet deal.
So you're saying
So-
just because they get paid well in the benefits, that's why they stay?
Yes, or a lot of it. Now, if you're working for an ass, you know, then that can overshadow everything else.
Yeah.
And you're gonna go down the road. So I'm not looking for someone that's gonna be a tyrant, you know, but, you know, I compare what, town employees get here compared to this area,
Yeah.
it's pretty good.
If somebody's looking for stability, this is a great place to work.
You
Yeah, absolutely. The very fact that we have a pension, I mean, it's amazing. We're lucky to have that. But then above and beyond that, I mean, it's all the other things that you do that makes them stay long-term. Because they can just go to another ASRS pension-paying company. I mean, they won't be, you know, committed to, or devoted to us.
Okay, good? All right, now Frank is gonna present to us a condensed and non-boring version for consideration and discussion regarding development of engineering standards.
Within 3 minutes or less.
You can't leave.
We're leaving.
I have 2 sick daughters at home.
I need to go help you. I know I wasn't the medicine.
Abandoned ship, look at these guys.
Am I ever not gonna be last on the agenda?
Tonight, I'm glad.
How many pages do you have in that? That looks a little long.
4.
Who cares if there's 4 slides on it?
You leaving too? You got 2 6 daughters, right?
Doesn't even have to.
Good night.
Good night, guys.
So,
He's got a sick dog.
trying to run through this, and I wanted to hit 2 of the easy ones tonight, kind of what we're looking at for grading and drainage on our engineering standards. So there's mostly items of just kind of glossing over, but there is a couple items I maybe would like council's input on to make sure I'm in the right direction on looking at these standards. I've got Civil Tech working with me on some of these draft chapters that we'll eventually pull together, but wanted to look at it. So again, this is kind of what engineering standards are. They're design standards, construction specifications, and standard details. They're not just drawings. And that's where we get in. These are all the chapters we've got to go through, but we're only doing grading and drainage tonight. And I'm trying to keep it at a high level so it's not boring and stuff I would like. Like for example, we've got grading here. So grading is your standards for all of your earthwork activities on here. Let me get to my note sheet real quick. Currently, most of our grading requirements are per the International Building Code. These standards will complement the International Building Code and provide a little standardization for when they need a permit, when a geotechnical report's required, and define what they need for erosion control measures. And they also complement drainage. That's why you kind of handle grading and drainage together, because water and dirt movement goes together. One thing that is pretty standard in this area but can be changed is I'm suggesting a permit requirement, a minimum threshold of 50 cubic yards of dirt being moved, or 10,000 square feet, or about a quarter acre of clearing and grubbing. That's fairly.
That's what everybody else is.
Yeah.
Don't we already have that? Thought we had 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Oh.
So just want to codify that
Oh.
and include it in these standards. There are some exemptions here that I thought were noteworthy in the draft chapter we've got. You exempt out work below basements and footings because that's already part of the building permit. Wells are exempted, and utility trenches are under the utility regulations. Again, then in mining and stockpiling, those are covered by other permits, so you don't worry about those. less than 50 cubic yards and less than 2 feet deep would be an exemption. And then if you're cutting slopes that are no taller than 5 feet tall and no steeper than 2 to 1, not a big deal. So that's pretty standard, and that's what we're looking for exemptions.
And you're saying those things are not codified right now, and you don't have any engineering standards to have that in
Right.
there? Okay.
So it's what kind of we do, it's just we don't have the in writing to back it up. This puts it in writing so engineering firms and everybody know exactly what to expect, and it's easy for them to follow, and it saves their clients money because they know how to bid a job to work in Chino Valley. That's what we're looking for, something that is easier and quicker, and in the end, it's better for everybody, and encourages consistent development. So it's a lot easier to do something when you know what's expected instead of saying, hey, what do I do here? The standards, it'll say when technical reports are required for over 50 yards. Again, plans shall conform to the International Building Code standard now. It's got standards. This is stuff that's high level, but there's more details in the chapter that goes into the standards for the cuts and fills, what maximum slopes you're allowed, what sort of setbacks from the slopes you need, how to handle drainage near buildings and walls, and all those details, and erosion control. You guys don't care about that, but all that's in there for engineers to enjoy. Yeah, and you can see the impacts of those, and why we need these standards. For the plan requirements, there's detailed requirements, so engineers will know exactly what to submit and can bid a job for their clients accurately and as cheap as possible to get what we need done. There's been a lot of talk with developers. Throw Jim Fletcher under the bus. He loves at-risk grading permits for some of his projects, which means the plans aren't fully approved yet, but he wants to go ahead and start moving dirt. This actually writes down what conditions you have for at-risk grading permits, knowing he might move some dirt, but the final plans might change, so he might have to move some back. That's what the risk is. And this gives it consistent so they know what to expect.
So at-risk grading is not like as-built then?
No.
Opposite end.
It's the opposite end. It's actually letting them start work while we're still reviewing the plans at
Saying
staff
that you may
level.
be wrong and change it back, okay.
Yeah, but knowing that a lot of times they're borrowing money with a lot of interest payments and things, so time is money. And we already allow this practice, but it's not really written down good, and this has it in writing, and it's pretty standard.
So if you do that on a project and somebody goes in and they start moving dirt and then the engineering is done, you say, wow, you blew it over here, you gotta go back in there for 500 feet, you gotta put back in 3 foot of dirt, you gotta compact and this, that, and the other thing. How do you enforce that?
Well, they acknowledge that their grading permit is at risk, that say they only plan to move 3 feet of dirt, and then the final plans show that it's actually a 5 foot fill section. They've gotta come in and add back that 2 more feet to meet their final plans.
We always have the final,
They-
they never get a building,
they don't get their
never
final.
a
Or they
certificate
wouldn't
of
get their
occupancy.
permit, 'cause
They
this
just
is
get-
Certificate
you
of
can just shut 'em down.
occupancy.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just their building permit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not lack of inspection or anything. All the inspection standards and compaction standards are all the same. Basically, with that risk, we tell them as long as they got their erosion control in place, and they're not affecting open right-of-way, existing roads, we kind of let them go ahead and start moving dirt. Again, that's mainly for acknowledgement of interest payments on loans.
Okay, are SWEPs required?
Yeah, and that's in here. And then this also talks about and puts in writing inspection requirements, like MAG's inspection details, and then what's required for certifications, like for pond volume certifications and things. And the record drawings, and I had a typo there still, I didn't catch, but as-built and record drawings for most people are the same thing until you talk to attorney folks. I'm from Alabama, so
Requirements.
Requirements.
we slur a lot.
Requirements.
So that's pretty much grading.
What was that? I missed it.
It was like Maverick.
Yeah, and this goes into drainage, and this is my favorite drainage picture, why you need drainage plans. Our current ordinances focus on flood prevention only, and the key, I think Andrew would tell you, state law, you wanna maintain the natural and historic drainage at the property lines as much as possible. That's kind of, is that case law is how you would say that, or
Yeah,
that's
well, it's
the law of
case
the
law,
land?
but it's case law between neighbors.
Civil.
The problem is that the neighbors have to sue one another to make it work, and the town's position is try to prevent the neighbor from messing up his neighbor in the first place.
Yeah. So what I'm looking at is adopting the county drainage manual basically by reference. They've got a really good drainage manual. It's based off a couple manuals, but I think the source was originally the Maricopa Drainage Manual. I guess several jurisdictions around the state use that, or a form of that drainage manual. So it requires professional reports, which we require a lot of now. You can add stuff in there, and this is up for discussion if council wants, for exemption based on lot size or zoning,
Okay.
and that's council decision.
We're kind of moving ahead, Josh, on the
Subdivision regulations?
subdivision regulations, on the minor, the major.
Right.
So, will we want to revisit this
Well, we'll have to
to correlate with those?
we'll have to visit language because currently right now the code says insert engineering details here.
Yeah, and there's no
And
engineering
there's no
details.
engineering details. So we're gonna have to just incorporate language in there that is gonna reference the adopted engineering design details that the town has adopted, even though we're gonna adopt it later.
So we may have a graduated scale to go along with the minor subdivision to a major subdivision. Yes or no? Or Frank, are you wanting these standards no matter
Across the board.
across
Yeah,
the
and
board?
I kind of talk about this a little bit, and you can make it. That's why I said, if you're putting a single family home on an AR5, it's probably not a big deal that you want to make someone spend $6,000-8,000
For engineering.
So but where that line is varies from community to community. So that's something you need to think about, is where you want to draw that line. Or do you want to base it on amount of disturbance, or, Josh and I said maybe zoning's the appropriate thing to look at, is what it's zoned. Do you want something zoned SR1 to have one standard where 2.5 maybe not a big deal, or is SR1 where you want to draw that line? That's a policy decision that
So
council
long
needs
do
to
we
make.
want to go into that under the UDO stuff, you think?
Well, where is the place to do it?
I would say in the EDO, you're gonna want, we already have a table that defines the type of development standards different subdivisions have to go through depending on their density. So that table, we could amend that table. There's also a discussion of streets, street design, lot design, and those types of
Yeah, we get into some of that here in a couple
information
slides.
in the next section of the subdivision regulations.
But they're not a subdivision, because they're.
No, but lot splits that have to go through subdivision because they create an easement or a street, do you require them to go through the full subdivision requirements? Or do you minimize some of those development standards for a 2 to 5 lot?
And there's also levels of drainage reports too that I'm gonna go over. So you may have,
Let's get to them, because I think you're answering questions in your later slides.
yeah,
That are
so,
gonna help everybody here.
Okay.
yeah, I'm trying to rush through these,
Into my rocks, and I was pulling weeds all the time.
but so,
I put that curb in, and if you notice, right at the end, we've got a washout.
Okay. This should prevent what you had happening. That's why this is important.
So, I mean,
to-
it is, that's what I'm saying, and I worked it out with my neighbor, but that was fine.
But
And
it
with
doesn't
something-
always work out with neighbors, and Frank gets those phone calls all the time.
So I would say at least 1 acre minimum, you need to go ahead and have drainage put in. because where I live, I used to get it all in uphill, everything washed into my rocks. And I was constantly pulling weeds and spraying for poison and what have you. Then I put curbs in on my driveway. And
Stop
the
it
water
from-
never came down, but it's washed out right between the property line down by the street. Cause all the water goes there
But
now.
you had to do it to prevent their wash,
Yeah.
their overflow.
So
You
it's a fine line, I think. I don't wanna overburden, you know, a person
That's what I'm
like
trying
that
to
has an acre of ground and they wanna build a house. I don't want them to have to throw an extra $6,000 at drainage engineering, but we also have to have some means of making sure that they don't affect
Yeah.
their neighbor.
Well, there's,
And there may be levels of this that if I can show in a couple slides that
Okay.
might help you with that decision too, because I think there's some conceptual reports that you can do as maybe a condition of zoning or lot split approval or something that may answer some of those questions.
Okay.
And maybe a good compromise. Yeah, a couple other quick
I've
things.
got 5 minutes, Frank.
You guys were talking, so, I mean, but I'm trying to get, so one thing I think we're
Jack's
lacking
falling asleep.
is we require, commercial development, but I don't know how well-written it is. And the drainage manual is really strong on what it requires for commercial and industrial development, and it makes it easy to follow.
isn't there a standing rule? The property, you can do what you want with the water on your property, but it comes in and goes off at the same point naturally. So in other words, what Mike did would have been wrong by putting in curbs and diverting it.
Not necessarily. You are allowed to prevent water flow onto your property if someone tries to do it. If you back it up into your neighbor's property by doing it and then damage his property, then you might have a civil fight between you.
But you can't change the discharge on your property.
Well,
But
again,
people do.
the idea is that you should not be discharging from your property to someone else's property in the first place. If you are doing that, then you've created a new flow onto their
If
property.
it's a natural drainage.
But
Because
if,
that's been the rule for me as a builder, is you can't change it. You can do whatever you want on your property, but it comes in, it goes out the same place.
well, and that's more of a regional flood control issue too. You don't wanna be backing up regional drainage ways into people's lots.
Yeah, and we run into that some where you've got detention ponds and concentrated flows and really try and wanna spread that back out before, to kind of mimic what was natural before the next guy.
That's the problem with what you're talking about, is you had sheet water,
Yeah.
okay, that
And how do
traveled
you-
and just went that way. Then you built a house in the middle of it. So now it's gotta go around, so now it's picked up velocity, so now it's cutting, and now you gotta wash.
Yeah, and this sort of thing looks at that at different levels of detail and expense, so. And we also get into culverts and street drainage, so, this is kind of what I was saying, the way the manual is written, is it a lot, and there's a may in there for the lawyers, that you may review, subdivisions, re-subdivisions, you can review rezonings, use permits, and commercial and industrial development, and any other development as needed. So it's very
Yeah.
broad, but this is based to let the review happen where it needs to, and council can, I'm assuming, can tighten or loosen this statement as much as they need to.
Yeah, we're gonna need to show them.
But show the
how
phase
we
1, 2, and
intend for
3,
them to
so.
do that so they can make choices.
Yeah, so
Not
here's
just-
the different levels of review the county manual does. A phase 1 is just a general concept of the design. A phase 2 is actually when they detail the drainage components. That's what most folks are used to, of the on-site and off-site plans. And phase 3 is just a final updated report of phase 1s and 2s. So you could say if someone comes in for a rezone and they want to rezone from AR5 to SR1 to maybe split into 3 lots, if they've got 5 acres they want to split into 3 lots, but it's kind of a flood prone area, the sheet flow area you were talking about, you could say fine, rezone, but you need to do a phase 1 drainage study to prove once these houses are built, show the concept of how the the lands are developed so that it's not flooding out their neighbor and you're not redirecting flow with all that stuff. And then when they come in for the building permits, we say, you have to follow this phase 1 drainage design that was done for how you set up your lot. That's kind of how that works. But it's not maybe the full detail level. When you're just at a zoning, you're more at the concept. But when someone goes to develop a lot, commercial lot or something, that's when the phase 2 would come in. These are more of the drainage components of the county manual. One thing I noticed they have is they deal with stormwater quality, which is the first half inch of rainfall. Like, when you're thinking of a parking lot on a commercial lot, that's all your oils and stuff coming off the parking lot. So they've got a good way of dealing with that to try and not pollute the environment. It goes into all sorts of methods of stuff you guys care nothing about with hydrology and study components.
You're right.
And it's based off how many acres of the drainage basin. There's chapter and chapter after that is just engineering stuff. But it is standard, industry standard stuff. It does require, it also looks at, when you got a pond coming in, when you're holding back that water, you might actually wind up, if the stream's coming up from behind you and you're releasing water from that detention pond, you could actually increase the peak flow of that stream, depending on when that water is released. So their county manual looks at that and has engineers look at that to make sure you're not actually making the problem worse for the downstream guys. There's a simplified design for single lot development to where they can just do, if they just do a full retention, it's a conservative formula, but that way they just do drainage plans rather than a full drainage study, so it saves them some upfront money. It's restricted to single lots for mainly commercial and development. And with that retention, since you're holding back all the stormwater, they also have details for how to make sure that drains in a couple days so you don't get mosquitoes and West Nile virus and all that stuff. So it's pretty well detailed. Differs a little bit from the county code because there's multi-tiered requirements. This is roadways. There's a little bit of different, they go into a little more detail at the county. They talk about stuff like not overtopping curbs, and on arterial streets, they want 1 lane dry for emergency vehicles, whereas our county code, our current town code is just less than 1 foot on roadways. So we can make that amendment if the town code wants to just do less than 1 foot. But they talk about different classes of roads and how much ponding you can have on a local road versus an arterial road. And I just use that as an example. I've even worked in jurisdictions where arterials needed 2 lanes open, collectors 1 lane open, and locals could flood. But they go into all the roadways stuff. Storm drains, I just had a question a couple days ago. Okay, what thickness of pipe do we require? We don't really have a specification on pipe thickness. County manual does. It changes based on the diameter of the pipe. The bigger the pipe, you need a thicker gauge pipe, but it's already in there, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and everyone around here that's in the construction industry already knows that. So it's consistent for the engineers and contractors. And there's culvert and bridge policies. And this is where the SWIPs come in on their erosion details. It provides a lot of detailed requirements for that, so they know what to expect. And it is very similar to what we practice now with the SWIPs, and when you're over an acre, you need to send in your NOI to the state, and all that's still in there. So it's basically what we're doing now. It's just a good write-up of a cookbook way to how to do it. And that's it. So there's a few things to think about is, we can look at when these levels are needed.
I think that's the point that Lon was saying, and I am also.
Yeah.
That we don't want to overburden the independent homeowner, but once you step out of that and you're splitting lots and so forth, yes, then you step up into the big boy category.
'Cause
But
my
we don't
thing
wanna
is,
get too
yeah,
onerous
what you
on-
wanna also do is protect the guy that's buying the home, so that he's not getting flooded. So it's kind of that compromise between, you know, you don't wanna over-regulate to death and become some sort of republic or something, but you also wanna protect the folks. That's, again, we learned, I think Mark Holmes said, the reason towns incorporate is to protect property entitlements so that what your neighbor does doesn't affect your property value, is all what it boils down to.
I think we actually have somebody running for council who's almost had this kind of a civil issue with a neighbor on.
Yeah, I've had several calls on that.
I spent 45 minutes on the phone with them.
Yes.
That's the last time I answered
About,
my phone.
about mulch, about piles of mulch. Yes.
Well, and the problem I see with it is that times have changed. You know, there used to be a such thing as a rational exception to a general rule, but you don't see that anymore when it comes to inspectors or, you know, or even engineering or whatever, when somebody wants to do something, because we all live in this liability world that everybody's scared. So whatever we put in print is law. You know, and there's no getting around it, and
No
that's the
wiggle room.
scary part about putting it in print, is then you're stuck with it. And you get some poor guy that wants to dig a ditch and needs to spend $6,000 to get a drainage permit for it. And so that's just, those are
Yeah.
the things that I would like to really pay attention before we put it down in ink to do the best
But
we
also,
can to cover everybody.
You get a guy that puts in 5 feet of fill to set a home on it, and now his neighbor behind him suddenly blocked off, so he's
Oh,
gonna
yeah.
flood.
Mhm.
Just had that happen.
Yeah.
I'd like to be in conformity with the surround, with the county.
And that's
So
one,
it's like-
Yeah, I think that's.
that's
a
why I
good
wanted to look at the county drainage manual, because to tell you, to be honest, most of the subdivisions that come in, they say, can we just use the county drainage manual?
Yeah.
So,
Corey and I were just
Yeah,
talking
that
about
makes
this
sense.
being more of a UDO thing, and I'd like to shift it over to them so we don't have to deal with it.
Well, eventually it'll come to you.
Huh?
Eventually it'll come to the full council.
Go eventually, and then we'll go with the
And
UDO's
mayor.
recommendation, and then it's their
Whoever that
fault.
will be.
the only
See how
thing
it
is,
works?
it's,
The
yeah,
council members, whoever
I
that
guess
will
we can, it's development, so run everything through UDO. Okay, that's where I got confused sometimes, cause when you look at engineering standard for streets, is that UDO or is that Roads and Streets Committee? But if you send it to both, it's suddenly a serial meeting and, or whatever
Where
that
you're
is, where
getting
you have
direction from
4
two
different
different-
council members talking about the same thing.
As long as they're posted, doesn't matter.
Oh,
As long as you meet the open meeting law with each committee, it doesn't matter.
Oh, okay, so we can even do that if we want to.
Oh, don't overburden yourself.
But then we get 2 different committees having 2 different opinions.
I know, that's why I don't do it that
Too
way.
many committees and we get nothing done.
Luckily, I'm on both committees.
So route this through the UDO.
See,
Sounds like that's
we
their
got adjourned.
recommendation.
Okay.
I make a motion to adjourn.
Okay,
Yeah, cause I'm getting nowhere in
okay.
these studies.
Bye.
Go.
Absolutely
I'll see you in the
nowhere.
morning.
Okay.
Wasting my time.
8 o'clock, 7 o'clock,
7 o'clock.
but you'll be here.
See,
at 8.
now you